Good viewer, you are watching Exert Us. This is because Exert Us makes you feel good, makes you feel fulfilled. You are enjoying this. You will continue to watch Exert Us for a long time to come. You want to subscribe to Exert Us, and you will. You will like and subscribe and share. You will tell your friends. Tell your friends about Exert Us. Your friends will come to like Exert Us, much as you are liking this right now, as we speak. Thank you for subscribing to Exert Us. See, that was easy.
The world is very different now. For man holds in his mortal hand the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life.
Begins a very special time of the year for us. It's the time of peace and reflection. One thing we should all be thankful for is that we live in America, where we have the freedom to change things and the opportunity to grow.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of your ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Well, if you're cool, you know, we're having a debate. Let me see if I can make my head a little smaller. And I might pull my head out occasionally like this. That's an example, because this is a debate on free will. And in general, also, what's the opposite of free will? Destiny? What would you say? What do you call it?
Determinism.
Determinism, right? Determinism versus free will. So maybe we should start by introducing each other. Let's start with David, because you're so close. You're so close to me, David. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you, man. Thank you. My name is I am David Long. I got a YouTube channel. I was for a long time in the integral community, which is like a philosophical meta theory thing. And I was teaching meta theory for a while. I got a bunch of videos on my channel with the same title as right here that you can check out. And I'm currently rebranding, coming up with my own version of meta theory, which is more emergentist. Currently, the version of integral is more like Eastern idealistic. And so, yeah, I'm coming up with an upgraded version with upgrades to all the elements. And I'm excited to be getting on that soon. But today we are going to be, thanks, man. Today I'm excited to be talking with all of y'all about free will.
And straight out of Mormon Zion, Seth, good to have you. I'm glad.
What's up, guys? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound.
What's up, man?
You make sound.
Yeah, not as bad as I was expecting.
You chose to make it tonight. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. It's determined that you would be here. Anyway, let's introduce Curiosity. Curiosity, tell us about yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Curiosity. I have a YouTube channel called Curiosity, in which I'm currently discussing free will mostly. It's been a couple of years, or rather 3 years, around three years that I've been discussing free will. I started off as a science channel, but then I've switched over to philosophy. So I'm basically interested in science and philosophy, but currently interested in free will. So yeah, if you want to check out my videos, you can in my channel. There have been plenty of videos that I've made, some arguments against free will, and I've discussed the physics of free will. Yeah, and I'm thinking about discussing neuroscience and psychology as well. in the later stages.
I'm stoked on that. Well, yeah, and everybody, make sure I don't forget this. Gennadi's really good about this. We're gonna make sure I put the links to everyone's channel in the description so that you guys can find all the channels if you're new. And yeah, I mean, you're a host and your throat hurts, but do you want to introduce yourself, Seth, or should I make something up about you? He's a wrestler.
Yeah, I think I'm good enough to talk just a little bit, and then we'll see how long that lasts.
That's really lucky for you, because I was going to say some stuff.
Yeah, I run a little philosophy podcast called Transcendent Philosophy. I come at things from a no free will atheistic perspective, but I'm trying to like build a philosophy of like meaning and purpose and direction. And
God bless you for that.
So, despite all of that nihilism.
He's an atheist, Andres.
Yeah. It's part of the book. I was going to say Harry Bold. Don't worry. I'm cool. Gennadi, your turn. What are you going to got?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I am Gennadi Stolyarov II. I am an atheist and materialist, but I also consider free will to exist. I wrote this treatise called A Rational Cosmology, which is a more general philosophical treatise about a naturalistic, materialistic view of existence, starting from essentially basic qualities such as matter or the spatial dimensions, and extending all the way to life, consciousness, and volition, which I think can be explained through a materialistic framework, but which all exist. They're not illusions, and we actually experience them, and our experience is real and of the base reality, and there's no God, there's no external force determining anything about our lives. We can determine the course of our lives, of course, within certain constraints, but these constraints are broad enough that we have real agency in the world. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. I'm also the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, and we advocate for putting science, health, and technology at the forefront of American politics. So think of it as an attempt to implement this vision, though we are a big tent philosophically, so we aren't just limited to atheists and materialists. We accept people from a variety of religious and philosophical and even political persuasions.
He's got some weird friends, like including me. You know what I'm saying? So then also Cyrelin, how you doing, Superstar DJ?
Hello. I'm not quite a superstar DJ yet, but I appreciate you. You almost got my name right. It's Cyrelin.
Cyrelin. I'm so
Cyrelin. No, you're great. You're better than
most
people.
That's such a nice jacket. I'm really sorry. I had to say it. This is so nice.
Oh, no, thank you. I had to wear my signature jacket for you, of course. Hello, I'm Cyrelin, and it's great to have been invited to this debate. I guess I'm the only person, I don't know, crazy enough or something to advance the position of free will, like pure free will. That's what everything is, essentially. It boils down, probably the best standing theory that matches what I'm about to talk about is biocentrism, which is the idea that consciousness itself is fundamental reality, that is base reality, and that is what causes everything else to snap into position and become forth.
Awesome.
So there you go. Yeah, I don't really have any other expertise to add to that. I'll unfold as we go.
That sounds good. All right, well then let's do a quick hand raising. Who's for determinism? Real quick. Okay, we got some determinism here. Oh, okay, I saw it. I saw curiosity. Yeah. It's your dharma. Okay, and then in terms of Stolyarov and Cyrelin, how far would you go in terms of free will? You think material free will is what you said, Gennadi?
Yes. So I see free will as an emergent property of material phenomena, similar to how chairness is an emergent property of material objects. If you think about, say, the legs of the chair or the other components of the chair, if you just put them in a heap together, they're not going to have the property of chairness. But if you arrange them in a specific way, in a specific spatial configuration, then they start to have a new property as a system, not as individual components, but now you can sit in the chair, or you can carry around the chair as a unitary entity. So free will or volition is an emergent property of a very sophisticated material configuration of many, many material components, the particles that we're made of, and it requires very specific preconditions to exist. But yes.
So free will happens like a bumper sticker. I like it. But then, Cyrelin, you're saying free will starts it off, right? Is that kind of the point? You're saying that it all starts with free will?
Yes, I'm saying that that's essentially the fundamental reality.
The building block is free will that leads to material, in your
The
opinion.
building block is consciousness, or the substance that has consciousness, that is aware. I'm not the awareness point itself. If you consider, for example, quantum physics, right, the observation effect, observer effect, excuse me, where everything exists in essentially a superposition of everything else until an observation is made, until something records something else. And then everything else snaps into place around that point. Something needs to make an initial observation in order for anything to exist.
Okay, so that's the most radical free will position. Who wants to take the most radical determinate position? Who would like argue the most determinate position? Curiosity sounded like you're a little in the middle, so you're not like you wouldn't consider yourself like the most hardcore determinate person?
No, I'm not. I'm not the hardcore determinist as per se, because I'm quite agnostic on how the nature of reality actually is. It could be deterministic, it could be indeterministic, or it could be a mixture of both. I'm not quite sure, but regardless, whether the world is deterministic or indeterministic, free will still doesn't exist. And the reason for that is if the world is deterministic, then everything is determined by causal determinism, like everything is caused by something else, and that is caused by something else, and so on until we get to the Big Bang. So determinism doesn't rescue free will, and even indeterminism doesn't mean free will, because indeterminism means there is fundamental randomness in the universe, and randomness by definition itself is uncontrollable or uncaused. It's arbitrary. You are not the cause or controller of the random event that happens in the universe. Suppose something happens in the quantum micro world. You are not authoring that. You're not consciously deciding, oh, this electron should go this way, this electron should go that way. You are not the author of that. And yet, all the decisions that you make are basically determined by those those random events, you can say, or are at least influenced by those random events. And either way, you don't have free will. So either the world is deterministic or the world is indeterministic by the principle of bivalence, or you can say the law of excluded middle. And either ways, we don't have free will. Or even if it's a mixture of both, in the micro world, say it's the quantum world that's running the show, and in the macro world, it starts behaving Newtonian wise, or so, or in the classical way. So either way, we don't have free will, depending on what you define, how you define free will, of course. So my definition of free will would be the libertarian definition, that most people have this sense of free will, that this illusion of free will, which I call, and it's basically the ability to do otherwise than what you actually do, such that the power of settling the decision between different alternative options is up to you. That is the conscious you that you are. So that's my definition of free will, and that definition of free will, and free will by that definition is incoherent, in my opinion. So that's my position.
Well, it sounds to me then like David, you might be like a little bit more determinate than curiosity. What do you think?
Um, I don't know. I think it's in some ways I would consider myself to be a semantic compatibilist or a semantic incompatibilist. Like there's ways I think I might be somewhat sympathetic to I'm trying to remember how to say dude's name. Is it
Gennady.
Gennady? That's right. Okay, yes. There's ways in which I could be sympathetic to his position in terms of like I think there's a big problem with language with a lot of this kind of stuff in terms of first person versus third person ways of describing our reality. I don't think that they're compatible with each other. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes from. But I also think it's important to make a distinction between determinism and fatalism, because I think a lot of times those two ideas get kind of confused and conflated, right? Like he was saying something about how like we're not all determined to do what we're going to do by some like divine force, or like things aren't already pre-written in the stars, let's say. That would be something like fatalism, where it's like we're basically just like stuck in this bulk universe, like the whole thing's already saved on a hard drive or something, and we're basically just playing it out with no ability to do anything about it. Like that's not my position. I think determinism, from my perspective, is just like whatever you do is predetermined by some other cause, right? So like for me, like I would say that like the freedom that free will people are potentially talking about is being unconstrained by either biological circumstances or conditioning. So I don't think that free will is a tenable position, because I don't think that you can be the author of your thoughts before you think them. I don't think that you can get outside of your perspective to choose otherwise, right? Like I don't believe in free will. Like I can't choose to believe in free will. I don't believe in free will. You know, like I can't get outside of my perspective to choose to believe in something different than what I believe in, you know?
Right.
The reason why I believe in what I believe in is because I have certain predispositions to things like epistemology and rationality that lead me to particular conclusions. And I can't help but think certain things given those, you know, given those predetermined conditions, if that makes sense. So there's no free will because my will is heavily conditioned and constrained by the circumstances and the context of life.
So you want to believe, but yeah, all right. And
I
Seth,
didn't say that.
you do. I can tell. Seth, though, he wants to black pill us really hard. Hold on, let me really quickly pull up a picture of Schopenhauer with screaming children. Tell us more about why everything is deterministic, and you know, go deeper, because I know you're like, I can tell Seth is the most hardcore anti-free will on the panel, right? Let's be real.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like just like the more you learn about reality, like every layer of science, I think Sapolsky, he wrote a book recently about this, and he articulates this pretty nicely. It's like no singular field of science can rule out free will. Like just psychology by itself, it's like, well, maybe the chemistry gives you free will. And then you learn chemistry, it's like, well, maybe the physics gives you free will. Oh, not the physics. Oh, maybe it's the quantum physics that gives you free will, right? And so if you only are specializing in one field of science, you can't fully rule out free will. But Sapolsky's point is the more layers of science you learn the sociology, once you learn every single layer of science, it's like there's no more places to put the free will. It's not in the quantum, it's not in the chemistry, it's not in the biology, it's not at the sociology. It's eventually you run out of places to put it. It's kind of like the God of the gaps. The more you learn, the less the more you realize it can't exist. It can't fit in any of these locations.
So therefore, that location doesn't exist because we can't find it. Is that the deal?
So there's a concept of proving a negative, right? Some people say, oh, you can't prove a negative. Well, if you have a specific location, you can prove a negative. You just like this thing is supposed to exist in this location. Let's look in that location. It's not there. Therefore, we have proven that it's not in that location. So it's like, okay, we look in all these locations. It's in none of those locations. Therefore, it doesn't exist, right? In any of those locations.
It doesn't exist in any of those locations, but that doesn't mean there aren't other locations. Okay. All right. So is the appropriate way for debate, now that we've introduced everybody in their positions, that every person has like a forum, a moment on the forum? Should we do it like that? Is everyone cool with that?
Yeah, and it should be the people who want to make the positive arguments go first.
Okay. So and Seth, how would you like to structure it, like moderate to then radical or radical to positive? How would you go extreme? Like, should we start with Cyrelin or start with Gennady?
I think we should just have each person just kind of like set up their main argument for their position, right? Both for and against, and then we should start to critique each other's positions
and throw chairs. Okay, all right,
yeah.
Sounds good. Yeah, maybe then in that logic, Gennady, would you like to open?
Yes, thank you. So my position is the material reality is what exists. It is primary. So we are all comprised of material entities, particles that follow the laws of physics individually, and we also follow the laws of physics, but we have volition as an emergent property because of the specific configuration of material particles that we are comprised of. And I do think it is a mistake to say, well, free will hasn't been located through external observation of this particular area or that particular area, because free will isn't a property of an individual particle. It's not a property of an individual tissue. It's a property of the entire system, just like chairness is a property of the entire chair. And it doesn't make sense to say, well, the leg has chairness or the back of the chair has chairness. No, they all combine and the system has chairness. Likewise, our individual atoms don't have free will. Our hand, if you cut it off, does not have free will, but we as a combined singular entity have this emergent property. And this emergent property does not violate the laws of physics because the causation behind it is material. That is, we exist as biological material entities. Everything that happened to us was consistent with the laws of physics and chemistry. However, that material causation does not imply that the future is predetermined, because we have the ability to effectuate any of a multitude of possible courses of the future by our choices. And the primary choice, this is where I agree with Ayn Rand, is the choice of focusing on certain aspects of reality or not focusing on those aspects of reality. You can look in the background behind me and there are numerous objects. You can choose to focus on some of them or on others or on none of them. Or I can raise my hand and I can move it in this direction, but I didn't have to move it in this direction. I could have moved it in the other direction. In fact, I did just now. And this does not rule out the existence of constraints on our actions. We are limited by the laws of physics in the sense that, for instance, if we wanted to fly, we cannot just choose to flap our arms and fly. There still has to be a specific sequence of events. In order for us to fly, we would need to build a flying machine, and we would need to figure out how to do that within the laws of nature. But we do have this fundamental choice to focus on building a flying machine or not, or to focus on doing any of a number of endeavors, and we didn't have to choose any one of them. Now, that also does not rule out that we could have influences on our behavior. For instance, other people whose ideas essentially motivated us to think in certain directions, to focus in certain directions, or not. Also, this does not rule out the possibility that upbringing can influence us or genetics can constrain what we can do. For instance, I am 5 feet 10 inches tall. I will probably never be able to be a professional basketball player. However, that also does not mean we are fated to a certain outcome in life. And the amount of variation that we are capable of bringing about through our actions, unless we have some severe illness or defect, For instance, a person with Down syndrome is not able to have nearly as much freedom or ability to choose as somebody who doesn't have Down syndrome. But for most people with relatively normal genetics, the amount of variation is sufficiently great that the range of outcomes for us as individuals is tremendous, as is our ability to shape the external world. Nor is this brought about by some external influence like a divine creator imbuing us with free will, because that free will does not have an external origin, just as we are not externally determined to do something, nor have we been externally given some sort of gift of free will. It arose as a process, a gradual process of evolution, where at some point in time in our species history, we became complex enough. And this is around 20 to 45,000 years ago, depending on which scientists you consult. We obtained this ability to intentionally direct our states of mind in a way that translates into outcomes in the external reality. And perhaps some lower animals have that ability to a more limited extent. For instance, I would grant that dogs or cats have some form of free will, some form of choice. If you throw them a treat, they might choose to go for it. They might choose not to go for it. But a lot more of their activity is based on reflex or instinct and is not as deliberately chosen as our activity. So free will is a very sophisticated emergent phenomenon. It requires a certain degree of evolution to have taken place. And as far as I'm aware, only our species right now on Earth has attained that degree of agency. Though again, limited forms of agency may be accessible to other species. It's also possible that there are other sentient entities in the universe right now, like extraterrestrial life forms, or that sentient entities could be engineered by humans. Think of artificial general intelligence that might have this property of free will as well. However, we haven't met them yet. That is also what the empirical evidence suggests. So that's my general position on free will. I want to comment a bit on randomness, because I see randomness as an epistemological phenomenon rather than a metaphysical phenomenon. Randomness doesn't exist out there. Randomness is a function of our limited information about particular phenomena in the world. So if we don't have enough information to understand what might happen, or what even is out there, then we can assign certain probabilities based on our prior knowledge of the world. And certain outcomes that we cannot predict seem random to us. That doesn't mean that in the base reality they actually are random. So I don't see free will as arising out of randomness at some subatomic level. I actually see free will as more of a macro phenomenon, where we come to be sophisticated enough that we, the system, are able to direct our individual components, including the chemical and electrical pathways in our brains, to make certain choices, and then to influence the outcome of other physical matter in that way by, for instance, moving our limbs, for instance, or manipulating external physical objects. So I don't think this is random at all. I think it's intentional on the part of us, but we have to come about before that intentionality can be exercised. So that's my introductory statement, and I'll be happy to engage with the other perspectives that are put forward here.
Okay, I'm not sure because I forget how we do this. Do I just continue on, or do we ask him questions first?
I think we should let. I'm afraid I'm going to mispronounce this. Cyrelin.
Yeah.
I think we should let her go next and kind of build up her position, and then
Fantastic. Okay,
I
then we'll
think,
go back. And
and then we'll.
again, if at some point, I just want to make sure if everyone wanted to ask questions of anybody, just let us know. But Cyrelin, tell us about
Hello.
radical true freedom. I think you know.
Yeah, I guess it is kind of, a bit of an untenable position traditionally, definitely most scientists, anybody, you can't really find them to support it. But there's the one, Robert Lanza, who's talking about biocentrism. And I think he's onto something there. He's got a big thing there. It's not quite falsifiable yet, but it speaks to something really true. And I didn't just like, okay, I found this article or something and like that's it, I'm gonna go with this. No. There you go. Yeah, I didn't. No, I haven't really even read that book necessarily. I've looked into this, like, but the fact of the matter is, you've mentioned, I forget who mentioned it, but somebody mentioned about looking in all these external places. I think it was Seth. I'm not sure. For free will, where is it? And it's not in any of these locations, then it doesn't exist. You're looking for will externally to yourself, the awareness point, who is actually, that's the will, that's the free will. You have to look inside yourself. And if you look at all of the spiritual traditions realistically, what are they telling you to do? They're telling you to meditate and look inside, focus on breathing until everything becomes single. That's what they're telling you to look for it for. That's where you find God. That's where you find all of that. If we're talking about the awareness point itself causing all of the rest of reality to spring into existence around it, then essentially we're talking about the idea that everything exists within the mind or perhaps the entire body of God, for lack of a better word. I mean, you can call it what you want. You could say the universe and just be like, well, this is an atheistic perspective. This is just how the universe works. But it's a little, yeah, it's a little tough to explain. When we're looking at all of these scientific, we got to find the proof. We got to find the proof, and I'm very much like that myself. I love looking into all these scientific, well, everything. I love everything that they're discovering and that we're capable of doing with science these days. It's just incredible. It's just incredible. So there's obviously something true there that they're able to put all these pieces together and are able to do math and calculations and predict how things are going to turn out. Okay, so let's build some things. Where I originally came to this idea, I think that was what somebody was asking me in the group chat, was where I left off. I meant to reply to that, and I'm sorry. Was how did I come to this conclusion? It's essentially, like they said, I've been meditating on it since I was a kid, like, because it fucked me up when I was a kid. I was like, wait, what happens when you die? Nothing. Where did I come from before I was born? That just the concept of nothing, it just never made sense to me. It just never made sense to me. So I had to meditate on it. And when, you were talking about chairness, developing chairness, because nothing actually has the essence of a chair, right? Nothing has the essence of anything. I think this was the Lotus Sutra, unless I'm mistaken, that Buddha was trying to tell people. The Lotus Sutra, where essentially instead of building up and looking like, okay, and then it becomes a chair out of nothing eventually. No, okay, let's pick it all apart, down and down and down. You tear everything apart. It's just made of all the same pieces of what? It's all made of the same atoms. It's all made of the same quarks ultimately, because atoms are just made up of quarks, an arrangement of all these different quarks and subatomic particles. It's all made up of the same exact thing, somehow holding each other in position to build all of these larger things. All of these larger things are all built up out of just the base thing. It's all the same. So how does that happen? I mean, that's what Buddha was talking about too. You get down to the bottom of everything. You meditate all the way down to the bottom of everything and you find yourself. There's nothing there. There's there's is no ultimate reality, and that's why you come. That's why he was talking about. That's why he was talking about. That's the best thing. You get back to that. You get back to that nirvana. That means nothing. It means nothing because we sprung up from the void, right? I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit out there. I'll maybe reel it back for a bit. Maybe probably somebody has any questions or possibly a way to reel me back in. I don't know.
Actually, I thought that was pretty solid. Just the idea of emergent, just because like I just want to say, and we'll move on. It's not really a question, but just to emphasize your point that we're saying, yeah, it seems emergent. It seems like at a certain point, it could be that we're having all this randomness, but we can choose between it because of selectivity, and so we actually are getting to free will. But you're saying actually it's the free will that's making that possible because everything is choosing to arrange itself, even at the very beginning. And I think that that's actually a very sound point. I just wanted to
Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, a little bit. Please, it makes it a little bit more clear what I was trying to get at there. Exactly.
You said good. Sounds like a good spiral, though. Should we spiral to curiosity? Because I like how that kind of looks like a little orbital. What do you think?
Sounds good. Yeah.
All right. So I've written down a note. I'll just read that. So the debate we are having is about free will. Now, free will has to be strong emergent because if it's weak emergent, then it's dependent on the constituent parts. And if it's dependent, it's not free, right? So if it's weak, it's not free. To say that free will is a weak emergent property is kind of a red herring, in my opinion, because it's not touching the topic of free will. The best I can give is that the feeling of free will is an emergent property, which is a content of consciousness. That would mean that I agree that maybe consciousness is an emergent property. Don't take that as a blanket quote from me, but I can grant in this debate that consciousness is an emergent property, and I can also grant that the feeling of free will, the illusion of free will, the conviction or intuition that we have free will, that is an emergent property. I can grant all that. But what I can't grant is that free will itself is an emergent property, that free will exists, because our will is not free. It's always dependent on antecedent events and causes and the laws of nature. So yeah, I agree that consciousness can be an emergent property. Now, even if you could get me to grant that, the real question is whether our will is free or not, whether it is independent or not. Is it independent of the constituent parts? No. There's no evidence at all for strong emergence. Even if the feeling of free will is an emergent property, the whole system is actually still either deterministic or indeterministic. And I've already mentioned how determinism and indeterminism both don't give us free will. If the whole is dependent on the parts, then it's not free. It's not independent. If free will is as real as an apple, then you have as much free will as an apple. Now, let's talk about some emergent properties that we have in the universe. For example, conductivity or electricity or wetness of water. A molecule of water is not wet. You have to have large collection of molecules of water for wetness. And for wetness, we will have to have subjective beings like us to feel the wetness. Now, wetness is a weak emergent property. It's not a strong emergent property. But this emergent property does not do away with determinism or indeterminism, because ultimately the constituent parts are causally bound. They follow deterministic laws, for it is the laws of physics that produce emergent properties. Change the component parts and the emergent property changes. If we were not made of carbon, for example, we were made of silicon, and suppose we were methane based life, our desires would have been different. So the whole depends on the parts. How is that free will? Now, let's talk about causal exclusion principle, if you haven't heard it, which is kind of an Occam's razor, redundant complexity reducing tool, which says that if a physical event fully explains an outcome and is causally sufficient to explain the outcome, then there is no need to posit or appeal to higher level mental events to account for the same outcome. In other words, the mind supervenes on the physical, and the physical being the materials with which the brain, for example, are made of. It's not just the brain that determines our choices. There's a lot of factors like biological and psychological factors that we were talking about, like endocrinology, the whole nervous system, hormones, neurotransmitters, genetics, all those factors, including epigenetic factors, our environment, our conditions, the circumstances that we were born in, the socioeconomic conditions, even the way we, even the nurture that we had during our pregnancy, the first, second, and third trimester, all these factors determine have some kind of contribution in determining what kind of a person we become. And there's no space for free will there. I think uh, Gennady said that chimpanzees, or for example, dogs have free will. All right, that kind of seems to be an absurd position to me. Would you say that dogs are responsible for their actions? I don't think so. But even if you say that, now you might say that a human is a human has more free will than a dog or a chimpanzee, and the reason human has more free will is because a human is more intelligent and rational than a chimp, and that small 1.5% genetic variance from chimpanzees accounts for free will, more free will than the chimpanzee. uh, but even rationality doesn't give you free will. We are slaves to reason. Rationality is the perfect example to show how free will doesn't exist. The moment we are convinced by a logical syllogism, for example, or understand a mathematical proposition, or are persuaded by a scientific study, then you helplessly believe in that argument or proposition or scientific fact. You're not free not to believe in it. Once you understand that the square of the hypotenuse is the sum of the squares of the adjacent sides, then you're not free to not believe it. 1 plus 1 equals 2. Are you free to believe that 1 plus 1 equals 3 right now with all the information that you have? No. You helplessly believe it. A rational thought is also an impulse, a thought or stored information in the brain which we don't author. We don't control that. Rationality is also a result of mysterious events happening in the brain which we are not in control of. Are you in conscious control of whatever is happening in your brain right now? Are you, do you know what's happening in the prefrontal cortex right now, or the ventromedial, or are you in control of what's happening in the limbic system right now? No, we are not conscious of that. But yet all those events happening in those different parts of the brain have a deterministic effect on what happens in our consciousness. Right. Even rationality follows causality, or perhaps it doesn't, and it's all random. And if it's uncaused and uncontrollable, it is not free will. Now, one get out clause from this is to believe the absurd conclusion that even animals have free will. Then my question is, what is it that doesn't have free will? Would you say that particles, subatomic particles, and atoms, they have free will too? another get out clause is to believe that free will is a strong emergent property, but I've already said that there's no scientific basis to strong emergent property yet. And even if it was strong emergent, it would still be dependent on either determinism or indeterminism. That is the constituent parts, I think. In science, we have not yet discovered any strong emergent property. Until we have evidence to believe that a system as a whole behaves completely independent of its constituent parts, we don't have reason to believe so. Most physicists are confident that strong emergence doesn't exist. The reason is not only that there isn't any known example for it, but that, more importantly, if there was an example, it would be incompatible with what we already know. We know that things are made up of smaller things. It describes what we see. It is a well-established fact, empirical fact. No one has been able to cut open an onion and not find cells. We always find cells when we cut open an onion. Matter occupies space, and it's always been small things make up large things. A theory at low resolution can always be derived from a theory at high resolution, that is, the subatomic realm. Now, for humans to have free will, I think particles will have to have free will. You can say that the photon could have gone the other way or whatever, but is that what you mean when you say a human has free will? Is a photon's free will the same as a human's free will? Would you say particles have free will? Would you call it a will? Even if you would call it a will, are the particles conscious? And is it worth having a discussion about free will or will, however you may define it, if that will is not conscious? If you're a panpsychist and say yes, is that conscious will free of the laws of nature? If you notice, we've gone down an absurd slippery slope, and that is exactly why free will is absurd and incoherent, in my opinion. And talking about volition, and I'll just respond to Gennady, or maybe I'll respond to him later. I will allow David to respond.
All right, here I go, I guess.
David, yeah.
Just one quick question. Curiosity, you mentioned your Occam's razor tool. What was the name of that principle you brought up?
Okay, and causal exclusion principle.
Okay, causal exclusion principle. Thank you
We
for
also have a super chat, which is cool. Free will. Can someone will themselves to never have existed? That is the paradox. You exist. You might change the story, but the fact that you were able to ask the question answers it all, says Hrothgar the Dane. Well, thank you. We love Danes. This is also some AI art of free will. These are whales debating, free willy debating free will.
Oh, wow.
All right. Sorry. David.
Okay. So as to not be redundant, Curiosity did a really good job of making a pretty good case for free will. I already said some things about it. I think as a good transitional move, I'm going to kind of just speed run some of my notes as response to things that have already been said. And I think that will transition us nicely into the next round of maybe more an open debate. So I think instead of rehashing more things about why I think free will, I'm just going to kind of respond to some of the things, the notes that I've already kind of taken from Gennady and Cyrelin. Hope I said those names correctly. So with Gennady, what I think is kind of happening here is he, in his last statement, he said, free will doesn't rule out influences, and it doesn't mean we are fated. I think when he's talking about determinism, he's confusing it with fatalism. It's like what Curiosity said when he said that the emergent is the feeling of free will. So when people talk about the illusion of free will, they're not denying the first person experience of choosing. Having choices, making choices is not what's in question here. It's Like the question is, the issue is that we are influenced in our choices in ways that we may not realize we have already been influenced. And so we will pick what we will pick for things that have already been predetermined, which is not the same as being fated. So this is so a lot of when he talks about our ability to choose. But again, that's not really what's at question here. So another thing that I think is happening is he also talks about chairness, which is this kind of emergent property. But it's not like a natural biological emergent, this chairness. Chairness is a conceptual projection onto this thing that we have created and we're using in a relative utilitarian way now as a chair, right? A concept that we've created. And I think Cyrelin, when she's talking about deconstructing the self and spiritual practices and stuff like this, part of what we learn when we get to these higher levels of cognitive development or consciousness, this metacognition, is ability to kind of deconstruct the concept of the self, to realize the relative nature of language, and to realize that self is a concept. So it's not just that agency or volition is, and that's also part of what is being talked about when we're talking about this illusion of free will. It's also ties into this idea of the illusion of a self. I would say the self is like a type of story. And so this gets into what I'm talking about in terms of like semantic compatibilism or semantic incompatibilism. Semantic compatibilism, because compatibilism is a position between free will and determinism. Semantic incompatibilism, because I'm saying that first-person descriptions of reality and third-person descriptions of reality are not compatible with each other. So like when we go to analyze the truth of a third-person objective statement, when we're doing epistemology, when we're trying to validate these claims, we're trying to see if the claim is accurate. Does it cash out with reality? When we're analyzing first-person claims, it's not exactly the same. We're trying to see if you're telling the truth or not, right? So those are kind of different, and both of them are used in a relative sense for utility. Third-person objective scientific language was developed later on in human development to try and really create a really accurate map of reality, so that way we could build stuff and put a man on the moon and like really agree on some solid stuff. But before that, language was just more poetic in general. You know, Zeus is raining today. We would personify lots of things and speak in a very poetic way. So first person subjective, I want to go to the store. When we look at that, I want to go to the store, we're not deconstructing all the relative nature of language to figure out if it's true or not. We're trying to figure out if you really honestly do want to go to the store. If you say you do, we're kind of taking agency and self for granted as an inherent part of first-person subjective language. And as Cyrelin said, there is no first person in subjective language anywhere in third person math or science or anything like that. There is no agency. So that's why these systems are incompatible. So I would actually hope that I could potentially persuade Gennady to come over to our perspective, since he's already more of an emergentist, to just realize that no one is denying that choices happen. Well, all we're saying is that our choices are influenced, and we already know that they're influenced, that we're trapped inside of a context, and we're trapped inside of a limited perspective. We're trapped inside of language and words. We only have relative symbols to be able to communicate with each other. Everything we know has been communicated to us. We only speak English. We're trapped inside of our perspective. We can't think things that we don't think. And so, yes, we're not fated. It's not pre-written, but things are determined by the relative context in which we find ourselves. Now, let me switch over to Cyrelin, because this is the more difficult conversation to have for many reasons. And it's mostly because we have much less agreements in terms of where we can start. You know, when I want to talk with Gennady, I can say, okay, well, we're already emergentists. We already agree on a lot of these different things, you know, so we already have a lot to work with. But she's not a materialist. She says that everything is soul, or everything is free will, or that everything is built out of souls. And she believes in it because of meditation. And she says ultimately you can deconstruct everything back to the nothing or the void, or so it's a more difficult thing to talk about, because really whenever you're talking about something like free will, this is like a more like distinction at the branches, right? Do people have free will? And really what we're going to find is that the disagreements are more down at the foundations, right? It's like, if I'm trying to argue with you about who's the best rapper, or something like that, you know, the Kendrick Drake thing is happening right now. If I'm describing who's the best rapper based on a whole bunch of objective standards and criteria about why I think they're a better rapper, and you're saying that, hypothetically, just as an example, that this person's a better rapper because I like them more, right? Those are two different discussions. And what we're going to eventually find is that even though the person who likes them more might be making arguments like, well, they had a more popular song, or they're like, you know, they're making all of these arguments that look like they're talking about the criteria. Ultimately, what we're going to have to really start to figure out is, what's your epistemology? How do you measure what makes a person a good rapper, right? So it's like, you know, this is why I was asking her in the comments how she comes to her conclusion that everything is made of soul, or that consciousness is fundamental. And now I see it's coming from spiritual ideas, meditation and stuff. And I'm very familiar with that, because that's a very kind of dominant position in the philosophical community that I'm used to. So I think it would be helpful, you know, we throw around this term consciousness, but there's levels of consciousness based on emergence, right? So there's pre-sentient consciousness, which are things like plants and things like this that don't have like a limbic system. They're not really able to feel or have impulsive reactions. They have like chemical reactions to their environment. There's sentient consciousness, which does feel, and it has more impulsive reactions. And then there's sapient level consciousness, which has thinking. And then there's such a thing as metacognition, which is this ability to contextualize thinking, which is what I'm talking about later with like meditation and deconstructing the self, and realizing that a lot of what we think of as ourself is just a mythology that we believe in and play out, a concept that we've projected onto this object, and then live out as if it's true, right? So this is some of the deconstruction that can happen through spiritual practice and meditation and stuff like that. But I'm wondering if she even really recognizes these different levels of distinction, because in part of the comments when I was asking her, she was saying that free will goes all the way down and back. So on an emergentist view, on a materialistic view, like the rest of us have, these functions of consciousness are the outgrowth, or the interior functions that correlate to tangible, objective equipment that allows for these things to happen, right? So like the reason that sapience comes online is because there's a limbic system. The reason that metacognition comes online is because cognitive development advances so much that we're able to think about thinking in this way. But she's kind of saying that if something becomes self-aware, that's kind of required for free will. And but she also thinks that everything has it. But I don't know how these lowest levels of consciousness could become self-aware when they don't even have the equipment to be self-aware. So this is where it would be important to be able to appeal to science, and I don't know if the spiritual beliefs about consciousness as the ground of being are really even technically compatible to even be able to have these arguments. And the other problem is, within the context of meditation, a lot of these things, transcending the mind is like getting to this place of stillness or nothingness, nirvana, like without thinking. And so that's not a place from which one can choose. If you're choosing from there, the same conditioned voice comes back again through the back door and then it chooses. So there was also this thing that was brought up about the observer effect. I think this is a problem that's, and I'll try to finish up here quickly. This is a problem that happens when we have a lot of ideas on the table now, in terms of the development of humanity, and part of integrating in all these worldviews is a thing happens that's called far-sighted mishmashing, right? Where you have something like witnessing in Buddhism, which is a particular type of language game that has its own set of meanings, and the observer effect in quantum physics, which has its own set of language games, and then these things end up getting conflated as if they're talking about the same thing when they're not. I just want to very quickly read a quote from a scientist about this very topic. He's a PhD in physics from the University of New York. He says, "Physics and chemists do not use the word measurement in the way that implies consciousness. Neither do they use the word observation to imply consciousness. An apparatus designed to do a measurement has the same physical and chemical effects if a human or an animal reads the machine or not. The physical interaction of such an apparatus involves processes that do the exact same thing in an inorganic environment as a living environment. If an electron wave is exposed to the thermal radiation, then it collapses into an electron particle. It doesn't matter if the radiation source is artificial, natural, or animal. The exposure of the electron to the thermal radiation is the measurement, independent of how it came about." This is their way of saying that, like, the observer effect isn't about a consciousness observing the particle. Basically, a lot of people learned about the observer effect from What the Bleep Do We Know, this show from this movie that was made by this cult where this lady Ramtha, who channels aliens, got a bunch of quantum physicists to do interviews, and then they made this sort of new age case that quantum physics is compatible with the New Age movement, and they sort of misrepresented the science to say that consciousness collapses the wave function in this double slit test, and that's not true. It's actually the act of measuring, the equipment that does the measuring is what collapses the wave function. So there's a bunch of confusion around this, and it's really, it's a major problem in quantum physics. Quantum physics is really good at producing lots of good data. We get lots of good predictive power out of that, but there's an interpretation problem because it's at such a low level of reality that's so far removed from what we normally experience that our way of understanding it is just limited. But consciousness at our level and the Planck scale of reality are two totally different levels of reality, and consciousness doesn't collapse things at the Planck scale into reality. So that's not a thing. So last but not least, I would like to share a slide, a picture real quick, if I can. Let's see. And then I will be done. Thank you so much for your patience in listening to me say so much. Can you see this? Can we see it?
Yeah, the pyramid's up.
Yes, this is called, this is an image I made. It's called the Pyramid of Philosophical Primacy. In the context in which I've done a lot of this meta theory, there's a big issue with integration. We want to take into account all of these factors, but there's a question of the primacy of what factors and how they relate to each other. But if we want to build a good worldview, a good philosophical worldview, we can't just wander into the territory of doing philosophy and start doing different projects at different levels. If you want to have a good worldview, you really have to build your view from the ground up. You have to start with epistemology, which means how do you know? You have to develop a good method of knowing. Ontology is what is it, right? So we want to know what it is. And then cosmology is origins. How did it come to be, right? So you have to start with these understandings of what's true, and then once you understand what's true, then you can figure out how to be good for what's true, and then do things that are beautiful in the context of what's true. But what often happens is that a lot of people will start with a cosmological assumption, like let's say Christians are like, creationism. And then what happens is they end up kind of negating these other projects, compromising them because they really favor this one project. It happens also with morality and art too, that some people might pick a moral position that they want, let's say libertarianism. It's really important to them that we have the ability to make choices. And so they'll kind of work backwards in a circular reasoning and confirmation bias style to cherry pick data from a bunch of other things to construct their worldview around this one particular project. But if you want all the projects to harmonize with each other, you have to build from the ground up. And that's how the projects will harmonize with each other. So I think that's kind of what might be not happening in these cases, is that potentially Cyrelin might be starting with cosmological assumptions about the nature of reality.
Seth, do you think you're the beach right now? Do you have to breathe over him like that? Let the man finish his monologue.
I'm almost done. This is my final statement. I think Cyrelin might be kind of building her worldview around a cosmological assumption that she would like to believe in, and so she's interested in science. Especially the one scientist who she says, validates her view, even though it's not falsifiable. Well, people who take a more ground up view and they start with a good epistemology, evidence and falsifiability are going to be majorly important to be able to really make sure that we're building on something solid. I don't really know yet, but I have an idea, an assumption. Maybe I'm holding it lightly. We'll have to see. Maybe Gennady might be starting from a more libertarian perspective, and it's really important to him that we do have the ability to have choices, because it's really important for morality to be able to hold people accountable for their decisions, which is very valid. We still need to be able to have morality. Morality can't be out the window if free will is out the window. We still need to be accountable for our choices. But if we're going to have a good worldview and do philosophy well, we have to build from the ground up and harmonize all the projects. Thank you so much for your patience and listening to me. I very much appreciate it, and I look forward to the next round.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. Well, let's also check out the super chat. Thank you, Phil. This channel is the most intellectually stimulating conversation on the internet. Stop flattering us. Keep it up, everyone. And that's like a face with like cool teeth. Oh, it's like a mustache, like a walrus dude. He's the walrus. I like it. Well, thank you. Okay, so then what's next, Seth? How's this go?
Yeah, I think now we should just kind of have a more free-flowing back and forth and kind of try to focus on one point at a time and just kind of go like that.
Yeah, there's a couple thoughts. Can I throw a thing? Is it all right to say anything? I don't know if is that a faux pas?
Okay, Andreas, we'll let
all
you
right, because it's unnatural for me, So I was thinking though, because it's true. They're like, and I'm not saying it's complete red herring that like Nexium was involved with What the Bleep Do We Know? But it is kind of not the point of things like the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment or, you know, the double slit experiment, which is less important. Even if you start to look at some of these experiments, it does get into that idea of whether or not things at their very nature and core have some kind of elected, you know, and this gets complicated if we're going to call it choice or whatever. I like the idea that we're looking for other languages. I'm a fan of Sanskrit. Like, if we're talking about Icha, Shakti, this idea that things have free will or have a choice or have destinial choice, I think is a very practical definition that we could say. And it's a harder thing for me to say that like waves are conscious. I feel like waves might be the creation of particles, and particles might have some very important quality here. I mean, when we were saying earlier, you know, how much will do they have? Do they even have the faculties for these things? That gets into why we exist. And I agree with Gennady that we're building more and more range of capacity with those things. But it does seem like there is like a perfect kind of medley that's making that possible. And we would like to ignore it. And it's interesting to hear what happens when you ignore it, because then you have this like idea of like, oh, this is what we have to do about the law now, because if we don't, I hadn't even considered really like the problems with when you just completely ignore free will yet, like that. Like there's all these other things you have to throw out in terms of, you know, your experience. And then I don't know, I find it really interesting when we're saying that these things might not have the same free will as us, that means that they don't have any will at all, because will is such a specific idea of just being able to have any say at all, or any sort of, you know, I'm moving forward. That sounds like the most primordial thing. Yeah, I hear that in so many parts of nature, even in terms of geology, like the way geology, like carbon is coming together, like whether or not it becomes like a superstructure, like a diamond or graphene. Like to me, it seems so fundamental, and that happens. Like that, you look at nature at its most core level and you see that beauty, that perfect symmetry, to me says that that's like so primordial that it probably even could be the thing that predates the material. So that's, I mean, I'm just saying, like, so far that's how I feel about it.
Yes.
Should
Thank
be
you.
up here with us.
Thank you to everyone for your remarks thus far. I think this is quite this is quite interesting. And Andreas, now you've joined our side of the debate on the bottom here, it seems. But I wanted to respond to a few of the points that were made by Curiosity and by David. And I want to also acknowledge some areas of concurrence. So it seems that we concur that we have consciousness, and that we at least believe that we are choosing, that we are not just some automata for whom even their very awareness of their existence is an illusion. And yet, I find that to clash with the notion that the self is an illusion, because we do have a unitary consciousness and self-awareness. And so that seems to be a fundamental phenomenon that we have to account for in some way. And I still think it's an emergent phenomenon, but I think if you believe that consciousness is real, the self that experiences the consciousness has to be real as well. And in my view, the self arises out of some basic properties of the biology of an organism. So I'm a different organism from any of you, and I don't perceive the world as you, I perceive the world as me. That's also a function of my biology. And I call this vantage point, the subjective vantage point upon the world, one's I-ness. Each of us has a different I-ness. And when we talk about the self, we're not talking per se about the content of our personalities or how we see our identity. Like if I see myself as an intelligent person or a productive person, or if I see myself as liking the color blue, that's not my I-ness. My I-ness is the very basic fact that I am perceiving the world as me, and you are perceiving the world as you. And you could also think of yourself as an intelligent person, a productive person, and a person who likes the color blue. That wouldn't make you me. You could copy every aspect of my personality, my views on the world, that still wouldn't make you me. Moreover, if an atomically identical copy of me were constructed right next to me, that person might think he was me. That person might think he had my memories, my experiences, but he would go off and live a different life from me, and I would not be aware of his life from that point forward unless he chose to relate it to me in some way. So I see the self as essentially being the fact that we exist as discrete biological organisms, and we may choose to think certain things about ourselves as individuals, but it's that basic fact that I want to focus on, because it's from that basic fact that we also have volition. So because we perceive our ability to choose, I don't see that as any different from us having that ability to choose in actuality. And fundamentally, as I've said, the reason why that ability exists is because we can focus on certain aspects of reality or not. So this idea that curiosity put forth, that we could be slaves to our own reason, that assumes that we automatically and necessarily understand the full implications of something. Like, if there's a syllogism, we necessarily go through the entire syllogism. And yet we see so many instances in our society of humans failing to think through a basic syllogism, even though if they did, if they took the time, yes, they would reach a certain answer. We see instances of humans failing to do math problems correctly, even though if they were to work out the logical implications of the mathematical concepts, they would arrive at what would be objectively the correct answers to those problems. So it's not the case that our reason makes us slaves to our reason, because we still have to manually go through each step. And at each step of the way, we can choose to focus or not to focus. And if we choose not to focus on certain crucial components of reality, we might miss the mark. We might make the wrong choice. My view on free will also implies we could be seriously mistaken. There could be an objectively best, most rational choice, but we could fail to make it because we don't notice all of the relevant parts. And if it's a complex chain of reasoning that we need to go through in order to make a particular choice, we might miss some key steps along the way. And our responsibility, our moral responsibility, is to try to think through these chains of reasoning to the best of our ability to arrive at the best choices that we're capable of. That doesn't mean we're devoid of constraints. So some people might not have had the training to fully go through these chains of reasoning as well as perhaps they ought to. But we also have the ability to focus on improving our knowledge and improving our skill set. And this is where I think it's really important to have this recognition that we're not just determined to have particular outcomes based on our influences or genetics or upbringing. Those can make particular choices easier or harder, to be sure. But I'll posit this example as one to think about. So let's say one is a teenager who was raised in Nazi Germany under Hitler's regime during a very formative period of time. And now in 1944, he is a concentration camp guard and he is in his 20s. And he has the choice to either very rigorously enforce the conditions of confinement of the prisoners in the concentration camp, or he has the choice to maybe help out the prisoners a little bit, maybe give them a bit of food to enable them to survive, or maybe even help them to escape. And it's really hard to make the correct choice, but I believe he is capable of making the correct choice. I believe that he is capable of defying all of his negative, deleterious cultural conditioning, all of the propaganda that he has been fed. I believe he's capable even of defying the likelihood that he will be punished. He might have to act in a sneaky, subtle, covert way to help those prisoners, but he is fundamentally capable of doing that. He's not fated to enforce the laws of the Nazi regime in the most stringent possible way. So that, I think, is the crucial implication of free will. And I realize the determinist statement is not a fatalistic one, because we might not know what the outcome of these predetermined processes might be. So I concede that the determinist might say, well, there could have been some countervailing influences on this young concentration camp guard that could have led him to defy the Nazi regime's propaganda. But I think
There
it's
would
more
have to be.
fundamental. Maybe, but I think it's more fundamental than that, because at a given point in time, he still faces the choice to focus or not. I could choose not to focus on something that I think might be inconvenient. And I grant that I have experienced that choice at times. So I could think, for instance, oh, there's a war going on in a particular part of the world, and it could threaten my life. Let's say it escalates into a nuclear conflict, but maybe right now I want to drink a cup of tea and have a dessert with that cup of tea, and I want to enjoy that experience of having tea and dessert, and so I don't want to think about this war right now. Has that gone through my mind? Probably it has. And likewise, I think that concentration camp guard can say at any given point in time, I choose to disregard all of the Nazi propaganda. I don't care. I see this human being in front of me. He's suffering. I don't like it. So that could be a good instance of disregarding some external influence.
It's so much easier for people to accept about the Soviets for some reason. Like, I don't know why. It's funny, you know? The people just imagine that the Soviets just one day said, okay, we're done with this propaganda. Like, but surely not the Germans.
They did. In fact, it's remarkable how quick the collapse of the Soviet Union was, and how it turned out that decades of propaganda really could not hold that regime together once people got even a modicum of freedom of expression and freedom to consider alternatives, political freedom. That is, of course, from a metaphysical standpoint, they had that freedom. One area where I would differ with you a bit, David, in the pyramid that you displayed, is that I do think ontology should precede epistemology. That is, what is primary to how do we know about what is true. Because
I mean, ontologically it precedes it,
yes,
but you can't know what is until you have a method to know what is.
Yeah, so we have to start with some basic assumptions about reality and our own vantage points. So Descartes did that when he said, I think, therefore I am. So epistemologically, he had to start with something he directly observed, which were his thoughts. But it's also clear that there is an external reality. So I prefer Ayn Rand's formulation, her three fundamental metaphysical axioms: existence, identity, and consciousness. So existence means that something exists out there. Identity means that each thing that exists has a specific defined nature. And consciousness means I exist, I'm aware of the external existence. And from there, you can derive an objective metaphysics, you can arrive at a rational epistemology, and go all the way to identity, ethics, politics. And I do think identity precedes morality too, because morality is for some kind of being. So the fact that we are humans with certain natures implies a certain morality, implies that certain things are good for us, certain things are not good for us, certain decisions are better than others. So that's the pyramid that I would set up. I think the idea of such a pyramid is a very sound one. I would just reorder the levels a bit.
Before I pass it off, I'll try to be very brief because I know I spoke a lot. But that particular primacy is specifically in relation to the project of doing philosophy. There's other things, other versions of the primacy, things I call nested quadratic holons, which are like, depending on what project you're doing, the primacy changes, right? So if we're talking about ontology, well, like you say, first there's things, and then later there's the consciousness. If you're talking about epistemology, well, you have to like start with your interiors, like Descartes, and then work your way out to establish things. If you're talking about morality, then there's the priorities change differently. So different priorities of the projects in relation to what the different projects are. That's why the primacies can be kind of confusing. So just to clarify. But I think we're in mostly very close agreement about that. Before I pass it off to probably Curiosity or how do you say it? Cyrelin.
Cyrelin. Yeah.
I just want to say one quick thing about the self. I think it would be interesting to think about the idea of people arguing about whether or not Uncle Sam exists, right? Like it's obviously a metaphor, a concept about a thing that does exist. So it's just like, well, you're confused. It's a symbol, right? And even within the context of Jungian psychology, we do a thing called voice dialogues, right? Where we sort of unfold the onion of the self, and there's a bunch of different voices in there. And you play this kind of game where there's different aspects of the self that are allowed to talk to each other, and they sort of exist as different selves within ourselves. Like Cyrelin was also talking about this sort of concept of a higher self that can kind of emerge. And that's different than the ego self, right? So there are all of these different concepts of what the self is, and all of them are just relative useful mythologies that we use in a practical way to be able to talk about the fact of our existence. Very similar to the way that we would use the symbol of Uncle Sam to be able to talk about what America is doing in a sort of, poetic way or whatever. It's this is kind of unraveling the relative nature of language, which I think also, like I said, goes back to your idea of chairness. Is it a projected concept onto this thing that for useful reasons? Like, can we make a distinction between the conceptual realm of things and the factual realm of things, like maybe like the relative truth versus the absolute truth of being? Like, self is a relative concept. The fact of your unique existence isn't what's in question when we deconstruct the self. It's the symbols and the ideas that we use to reference that territory. It's a map and territory issue, if that makes sense.
Interesting. So I do wonder, do you agree that the individual organism exists as a distinct, separate organism with its own awareness? You just think that the self is more of a conceptual framework by which that organism understands itself, for lack of a better
Well,
term.
all of philosophy is about trying to figure out how you divide up aspects of the universe, right? Like, that's how we came up with this idea of the atom and monas and stuff like that in the first place. Again, all of this stuff is really relative, helpful ways of talking about things. I do think that we exist. I think that, we exist in the universe. The universe is itself a thing, and we have this idea of the holon, right? Which is a whole, which is simultaneously a part of something larger, but also simultaneously has larger or smaller sub holes within it, right? And so, like a person is sort of this intermediate thing, and that's where you get nature and nurture. And I think this comes back nicely to the idea of free will, because we in psychology we talk about nature and nurture. So you have the biological bottom up forces of nature putting pressure on you to be what you are, and you have the top down structures of the systems in play in the world around us as nurture, pressing us to be who we are. And somewhere in the middle, through this rhizomatic contagion, we become who we are as a self by the pressures from both sides, as you know, in this kind of unfolding holacracy.
Interesting. And I will let Cyrelin respond to this. I will just say, in my view, yes, nature and nurture can have certain influences, but there's also the agency of the individual at any given point in time. Even if your set of choices may have like outer bounds to them, within those bounds, you can choose one or another or a different one. And there are typically not just two. There are typically thousands or millions of possibilities.
If you have thousands of millions of bounds, then you're not free, right?
But it's like
cut to Mendelbrot algorithm. Sorry.
Yeah, that's where the hold on, yeah, for sure.
It's like there's a lot of freedom in a Mendelbrot, bro.
If you have a constrained optimization kind of situation, so you have on a graph a bunch of lines, a bunch of intersecting lines, and a space is bounded by those intersecting lines. And within that space, the area is not zero. So there is some range of where you put your point, which is your choice.
Okay. So there's like a narrowing cone of possibilities in which you might be able to choose. Like you're standing at a grocery store and there's a bunch of oranges in front of you. Which one do you pick?
Oh, but like it's macro and micro. It's macro micro. So what's ironic is in your lifetime you might think of it that way, because in your lifetime you're narrowing and trying, like for a certain, like as a baby that's not true. Right? At a certain point you have a peak and then you start to lose your choices. However, if you think about it, the human race is like this super organism that's immortal, that's been moving forward, gaining information, kind of carrying itself forward and gaining capacity. This is something that we've all kind of talked about. We have more and more opportunities. I could be watching Planet of the Apes right now, and I chose to have this debate, right? And like that was a really hard choice. No offense, I love you guys, but I figure I can probably do this or that later, which is crazy, like how that affects my life. And what is this? This is a moment where we're sharing this conversation about free will and determinism, but we're all over the world in different places at the same time using technology that people had to build. And I exist because of my parents, and you do too. And it's really kind of interesting that free will is part of this determined, like it's printing and copying itself, right? It's a thing that it's just making itself more, and now it has more ideas because it has more data and has more sensors, so it has more opportunities. So it does feel like free will is expanding based on that, but also that it couldn't have just started as zero, because if it started as zero, then it wouldn't have been able to just exponentially grow, right? It has to have started with some sort of amount of existence, you know. So I feel like it is a primordial part of everything.
All right. Yeah, I agree. I agree, both of you. I would like to respond to some of the things David was talking about earlier. Where did we want to? Yes. So the influence. Gosh, you seem to have this big. It's so it seems so strict about this influence. If you're influenced in any way, then it's like you can't resist the influence. But I tell you, you can resist a whole lot of influences from a lot of sources if you, well, I would suggest, okay, here you talked about meditation. How you get to a mindless point, right? How it's very much like trying to achieve that thoughtlessness. And yeah, like a lot of that really kind of, set the hairs on the back of my neck on end, right? And I was like, that seems a little suspicious. Yeah, but then you got to look at the other end of it, mindfulness, where you're actually saying, okay, hold on, let me go outward too and say, what am I feeling right now? What am I smelling right now? What's in the air? What's in all of these things, colors from the external information? And you wait with that information and you sit with it and you know, okay, I'm not going to just respond, not just going to respond to what's happening. I'm going to be like, what is this sensation? And sit with it. And you sort of meditate with the sensory information. And this is where I'm going to start drawing it back to some quantum physics. Where you brought up a very good point. You brought up a very good point with the observer effect. Like that's absolutely very much the case when a lot of these scientists are. We're not talking about we're not talking about the atom was looking at something, so then it happened. Like no, like the photon was looking at something. That's not what they mean. No, because the scientists saw the experiment happen, then it happened. Like, no, that's not what they mean. Like, yeah, absolutely, I get that. It's a great point. Uh, but thank you, Andreas, for bringing that back too. Even the scientists get down to the very bottom of it, and they're like, "Well, how is this happening? How, like, why? Like, why does that happen at that very level? What is even causing that to happen?" There's kind of a big problem in a lot of the sciences, or among scientists, maybe a better way to say it, right? Um, where they've sort of agreed, and maybe they're coming around to this a little more in the last couple of decades, but like for a lot of the last several centuries, they really sort of agreed to, uh, let's set aside these spiritual questions of what is the self and like what is like this experience that I'm having, right? Like I am having an experience. What is that? They said, you know what, let's just not worry about that. God, like only recently they've like a bunch of scientists are getting together to be like, let's change our views on animals because right now we've been looking at animals basically as automata and we're the only ones that have a subjective experience. So like that's truly insane to me. like have you ever met a dog? Like that is a creature that is having an internal subjective experience 100%. That is a creature that has fun and enjoys things and yes, that is a
Totally agree.
subjective. So you know um where was I going to bring it to with quantum physics? All right, I just wanted to make that point about the observer effect too. Uh, but quantum physics, what I was going to bring it back to here was the Heidegger, no, Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? Where when we're going to measure a particle, you got to stop it. You got to grab it. And when you grab it, you can't tell where it was coming from. You can't tell where it's going to go. When you're measuring the way it's moving, okay, let's try to measure how fast it's going. Okay, we could get a read on that, but you can't quite get a bead on exactly where it is. You can just kind of, it's somewhere around there. It's going real fast in that direction, but it's real hard. So, gosh, it's the same thing. It's the same thing as practicing mindfulness and catching the information. Once it's in that position, it can go any number of. It's a probability spectrum arises, I believe, in quantum physics. Um, a probability spectrum arises, and then it can go into a number of different directions based on where it's locked in now. But we can practice the same thing on ourselves by catching where we are now and meditating on it. before deciding which direction to move forward in. And that is how you can practice free will right now. It's maybe a thing to develop, but like you can change your fate by doing that, meditating on exactly where where you talk about symbols. You talk about symbols a lot, like how the symbols are basically guiding us along to do things, and like that's in our subconscious. Our subconscious creates our reality before we even perceive it. Like I'm not, you know, consciously thinking, build a wall there. There's a wall. Now I'm in a room. Okay, like no, that subconscious develops that based on the sensory information that I'm receiving. Right. So,
That sounds like an argument for determinism.
does it? I
Well,
don't
there's a
know.
marriage, I think, between the two. I keep hearing it seems like again it's like a bit of a tug of war battle, this idea that it's like one or the other. And we're not saying that there isn't a certain amount of physics that define your reality. I think that's kind of the point that Gennadi's making, is that those physics actually encourage and increase the capacity of things. Like, so data recording is so important, right? Like the idea that DNA can record so that your next generation has this idea on where to go off of. And then this idea of meditation, which it might sound like just, philosophical, but in a physics sense, being able to be non-reactionary and making your own choices it's like a great example of how things should work, where you're born without all of the knowledge the trauma that your parents experienced, but you do have the data recorded. And this data is really valuable because it gives you an idea on how to mutate next, right? And that mutation might be limited, but it's far less limited than it was, a million years ago or 100 million years ago, or whatever you're trying to say. Because like to be a shrimp, to become a crab, right? Or whatever it is, this idea that you're becoming more is really, it's hard to ignore. I get that in our lifetime, and this is something that's interesting to me. Like, it sounds like a big problem with people on their free will things. Like, well, I am lacking in the amount of free will I want to have. And I agree with you. Like, I wish I could live forever. Gennadi's a big fan of conquering death. I think if we had the capacity to conquer death, this conversation would be very different, because we'd be like, oh, I mean, but we kind of do, right? If you start thinking about it, we are able to think about these things and make solutions to them. And the key there is thinking about them leads to the material solutions. So it does seem to me that there is this emergent consciousness that then records, builds upon itself, sacrifices, suffers, and goes through all of these lifetimes, like religiously, but then eventually evolves into a thing that can conquer its problems. And maybe one of those problems turns out to be death. Maybe death was a solution for a long time, and now we don't need it anymore. But that would be the kind of thing that says to me, free will is also a relationship that we're having. It's not just my free will. It's the collective species free will. It's the, physics of the atom's free will. That kind of makes more sense all of a sudden, why it's not possible for me to make all of my, when people, it's the same. So this is the same argument that Christians make when they're like, why don't I get my prayers answered? Because other people prayed for Palestine to be destroyed, and other people prayed for Palestine to be saved, and all of these different, why can't we all have our prayers answered at the same time? Maybe it takes a certain amount of awareness that we're made up of this consciousness that's building itself and choosing through selectivity which thing to manifest and to sustain, right? And then from there, you're like, okay, I have not just my genetic memory, but we even have this Akashic data center at Google that can help our generation evolve on a macro scale, telescopically, rapidly, right? And we choose to do that. So I don't know. It's just really hard to say we have no free will, because the choices get so drastically expanded at such a rapid pace that to say that they're just random, when we're able to forget who we are, choose who we become, and then make choices on where the universe goes, is just, it seems like that's pretty valuable.
So
No one's really denying that there's, that there's will. No one's denying that there's choices. It's specifically free will, like unconstrained will. Like, it's not more or less. It's whether it's free and unconstrained or not. And it seems like nobody here is actually arguing for unconstrained will. It's all like, well, there might be a narrow cone of possibilities, or like, well, yeah, our subjective, or our subconscious already creates our, our reality. Well, we're done here. There's no free will.
Well, I would say if there's a cone of possibilities, first of all, I would say there are still millions of choices within that cone. But if there's a cone of possibilities, and some of the possibilities that we can choose could literally take us to indefinite lifespans, that's just all the free will that I need to very strongly assert for the existence of free will, because it's a matter of the variability in the consequences. So if certain choices that we are capable of making can literally lead us to die, and certain other choices can lead us to never die, potentially, isn't that consequentially the broadest possible spectrum of variation in terms of the outcomes? Now, some people might say, well, you need to have been exposed to certain ideas, or it would really help if you had a good upbringing to make the correct choices. It would really help if you didn't have genetic disorders, if you didn't have Down syndrome. It would help if you were actually human and not a cat or an amoeba. Okay, I would grant that. However, if being a genetically fairly typical human with the fairly typical influences that a fairly typical human in the early 21st century had, we are literally capable of a range of choices that goes from us dying very quickly to us potentially never dying. That is an immense amount of freedom, and it should lead us to think very
I want to
carefully
jump in here real
about
quick.
what we focus on or not.
So I'm noticing like a perspectival gap between the two sides here.
Punch from Gennady straight to ding, 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 ding. Pulling in Seth. Sorry.
Yeah. So I kind of want to bring up this perspectival gap that I think needs to be reconciled here to get a little bit more clarity in how we're communicating on these issues. So it seems like the no free will perspective has this backward looking focus. It's like, what are the prior causes that lead to this choice? And it seems like the free will perspective has this more forward looking focus where it's like, oh, but if I do these things, I get more and more choices. And isn't more and more choices free will? And I think the key question is, like, maybe you originally have 3 choices, and then you like focus, you meditate, you calm down, you slow down, and maybe that process opens up 10 options. You're like, ooh, meditation opened up more options. That's free will, right? But the question is, were you free to do the meditation? Did you have ADHD? Did you have all these other things that prohibited you? Like, what are the prior factors that allowed you to have more options, right?
It's interesting that you bring up ADHD because yes, I do have ADHD. Self-diagnosed autistic, but definitely diagnosed ADHD since I was a little kid. They had me on the I forget the specific medicine. It wasn't Ritalin, but it was one of those for a few years. And at a certain point, 12, I think I was like, I am not taking these anymore. I'm like more fun without it. I'm not gonna do it. It's really boring. It's really boring. I'm just like, this is boring. I'm boring. I don't want it.
Can I jump in real quick? I mean, it's been more than an hour, I think. I
Oh
haven't
my gosh.
spoken.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay, so I would just like to reflect on our debate, and I would like to clarify a few things. So one of the things is that we be aware of what kind of definition of free will we are working with. So the definition of free will that I earlier on mentioned is the ability to do otherwise than what you actually do, such that the ability to decide among the choices is up to you, such that it's free of all nature and nurture influences on you, completely free of nature and nurture. And then it depends on how you define nature and nurture, by nature, I mean all the environmental factors, epigenetics or whatever, and by I mean, sorry, the opposite. Nature means genetics and your brain and all the physical constitution or biological constitution that you are. And nurture is basically the environment and all the conditions that surround you. So when Janadi is talking about free will, I think he's saying, all right, we have all these influences, but still we can choose while being determined by those influences. That doesn't make sense to me. At the end of the day, that's also determined, right? Uh, I would like to go back to the consequence argument, or kind of the deterministic argument, which says that we have the initial conditions of the universe and we have the laws of nature. Then the future is just determined. So what I will say in the next few minutes is determined already, and I have no choice about that, because the initial conditions and laws of nature interact with each other, and it just goes on and on and on, and I have just no choice about what I will say. Now, like David said, it's not fatalism. So the crucial distinction that I would like to point out here is that uh, determinism is saying that whatever you will do in the future will go through you. This is how I like to conceptualize it for myself. It will go through you. It's not like whatever you think this is going to happen. It's that what will happen through your thinking. You will think it towards it. You will think that thought towards that outcome in the future. So yeah, that's what I wanted to point out. And I would like to respond to a few points that Janadi made. So Janadi is a materialist, and he would agree to me that we are comprised of materials that follow the laws of physics. But he, at the end of the day, says that we have volition. And just like David and Seth try to point out right now, that we are not saying that we don't have choice, we don't have volition. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying that we don't have free volition or free choice or free will. We're not free. Like I said, nature and nurture completely determine what our choices would be. Now, we have this illusion of free will that we think that it's going through us. We have full complete control over our decisions, but that's not the case, because at the end of the day, there's this underlying concatenation of nature and nurture that's going on that we are not aware of. So whatever decisions or choices you're making, that concatenation of nature and nurture is at play that we are not aware of. And the fact that we are not aware of that itself is the illusion of free will that we are working with. So the volition, like I said, it's not free volition. It's not to say that we don't agree that volition exists or that voluntary actions are different from involuntary actions. Voluntary actions are different. They have a different phenomenology. They have different experiential content. Like we have this, like suppose I'm trying to lift up this mouse. Volitionally, I can either lift up or not lift up. So it's different. It's different from reflex action or some unconscious action that we do. Like it's different from when like someone touches me from behind and I'm scared, the limbic system is at work, and I just try to fend off or try to save myself from that. That's reflex, and that's not voluntary, it's involuntary. But voluntary actions have a different phenomenology. We feel different. It feels different, it's experientially different. We have an expectation of what's going to happen, but that doesn't have much to do with free will. Whatever volitional action that we do, whatever volitional decision that we take, is still determined. So another kind of example that I would like to give you that would help you understand this is the two types of I would like to just boil it down to two types of systems that are in our brain. Let's boil it down to rational and emotional systems. So suppose emotional system tells us not to do something initially. It's a first order thought that we have, and then we rationalize it, and our prefrontal cortex, the cortical brain, is at work, and suppose after some reflective thought, we decide to go for the rational option. Okay, we go for the rational option, but we don't know what weight, we didn't determine consciously what weight the rational option will have while lifting up this mouse, for example. We don't determine that. So let's suppose that we take hours of deliberation between two choices, whether to lift up or not to lift up. We are sitting there for hours and thinking, should I lift up this mouse? Should I not? After we just switch over between these choices. Let me lift up. No, let me not lift up. And just goes on for hours. And at the end of the day, after a few hours, we just decide, oh, let me lift it up. You don't know why that lifting up thought had that much amount of weight, or why it overwhelmed. It's at the end of the day, underlying physical phenomena in your brain, in your neural circuits, that's at play. All that physical system, the neurons, the neural circuits, the neurotransmitters, hormones, and endocrinology, all those kinds of stuff, genetics, they are at play. We are not free. By free, I mean our conscious self is not free of those factors. We are, at the end of the day, slaves to those factors. We don't choose our desires. We are just slaves to our desires. It's Schopenhauer. I mean, Andreas brought up Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer said that we have a will. We can. What was that? We can do what we will. I'm sorry. How did I forget that? We can do what we will, but we can't will what we will. We can do what we will, but we can't will what we will. It's a pretty beautiful quote from
Man can do what he will, but he cannot will what he
yeah.
wills.
Yeah, we can do what we will, but we can't will what we will. That it's to say that we can do what we want, our desires. We can act in accordance with our desires, but we don't choose our desires. Where did those desires come from? Those desires, we did not have any part to play in those desires actualizing. Those desires are a cause of mysterious events happening, which have antecedent causes and effects. This causality from right back from the Big Bang, that's at play. So every choice that we make, be it rational choice or be it irrational or emotional, everything, we are not free to choose those choices. I think David pointed out that we can't choose to think what we think in the future, in the next moment. We don't choose our choices. I mean, we don't choose our thoughts. We don't choose our desires. Those desires manifest in our consciousness, and we just act in accordance with it. So suppose we can say, oh no, I can do what I don't want. Like suppose I want to go to the gym. I mean, I don't want to go to the gym, but still go to the gym, even if I don't want it. But you want to get fit. Your desire to get fit overwhelms your desire to stay lazy in the bed. So whatever thing that you do, whatever you do consciously, you do because you desire something or you want something. But you don't choose your wants. You don't choose your desires. Those desires were chosen for you by the universe. Whatever conscious decision that you take. That's what I'm saying. Like Andreas said, no free will seems a bit absurd, but no, that's the consistent position. You can't say that for some of these we don't have free will, but there are some choices for which we have free will. That's not a consistent position. We just don't have free will. That's the true nature of reality. Because
to say you have free will is like to claim to be God, or to say that nature and nurture don't apply to you, to act like that you're choosing from some position outside of your context and your ideas, like you're choosing from a unconstrained unconditioned, uncontextual perspective. right?
That would
And
explain a lot about me, actually.
that's what it means to be free. If you're not saying that you're free in that way, then that's not the kind of free will that we're talking about. We both agree that we make choices. No one's saying that we don't. It's whether those choices are completely free or not. And nobody, it doesn't even seem like Gennady is really even saying that he really believes that he in his first comment he said this doesn't rule out influences. No, by definition it does rule out influences. That's what we're talking about. If you're influenced, then you're not free.
But
An
if you have
influence isn't the
you're
same
not
thing as
free.
being completely foreordained. So an influence could be a probabilistic kind of influence. And by the way, my cat is chiming in and saying that she has free will. I can interpret what she's meowing about right now. But anyway, I'm going to lift up my mouse here, but I didn't have to do that because there's nothing really in my intellectual background or my life history that necessarily says I would have been more likely to lift up that mouse in response to Curiosity's comments, as opposed to just being like this and using my mouse in an ordinary fashion. But I did it because I chose to do it, and that doesn't necessarily mean that I could become a professional basketball player tomorrow. So there are still constraints, and there are still influences on what I might want to do. However, I have enough agency within those parameters that I can still determine myself many of the outcomes of my life because I want to, not because something else led me to that. Now, I want to comment on something Seth said because I think this was an apt observation that he made, that the proponents of determinism tend to look backward in terms of what caused a particular decision or a particular chain of events to come about. And the proponents of free will tend to look forward and say, well, what is the range of available choices? What could happen given possible chains of causation going forward? Can we cause one of those chains as opposed to the other? And I actually don't think that there is a conflict necessarily. So if we look backward, obviously, the events that have happened, and they're all compatible with the laws of physics. We can explain them by reference to the laws of physics. But that doesn't mean that those prior configurations will absolutely be able to tell us what's going to happen next, even if we had all of the knowledge, all of the information, super processing power. So it's not just the limitation of our foresight as finite biological beings that prevent us from foreseeing that. It is that there are now 8 billion of us who can make little choices that would lead to different outcomes. So the reason why that is, and why I can say this is all entirely compatible with the laws of physics, is because the laws of physics are themselves conditional. They're formulated in a conditional manner. So to paraphrase Isaac Newton and his 3 laws, if an object is at rest, it will remain at rest unless acted on by an outside force. So there's a conditionality there. If an object is at rest, and then unless it's acted on by an outside force. And if a force is acting on an object, it will be equal to the product of its mass and acceleration. But that's if a force is acting on that object. If an object is pushed by another object with a certain force, it will exhibit an equal and opposite reaction force on that object. So all of these laws of physics, properly rephrased, will entail this if component to them, which renders them conditional on the given situation and raises the question, what brings about the situations wherein those laws manifest themselves? So I would say at any given moment, we have a range of choices, and they could be little choices. They could be a choice like, do we raise our mouse or do we not raise our mouse? Do we move our finger or do we not move our finger? But the sum total of these choices exercised by all of us, and we are all doing this to some extent, can lead to radically different outcomes over time. And maybe some people's choices are more important than others in affecting those outcomes. Maybe some of our choices are more important than others, like the choice to jump from a 5-story building or not to jump from a 5-story
There's
building.
also
That
a
will
difference-
probably be a crucial choice for each of us. However, I don't see the fact that we can look backward and explain everything through the laws of physics to imply that we can thereby, even with complete knowledge, predict future states of the world, even with complete knowledge of the present state of the world, hypothetically. So
I don't
when we're
think
talking about,
anybody is-
when we're talking about choices, I would like to point out that we're talking about free choice. Do we have free choice? That choice is not free. For
So
first,
on a
Right.
macro
And
scale, we might though. If you think of like just really quickly, we just mentioned earlier, like Icha Shakti, you could compare to like Adi Shakti. The idea that there's Trishna is different, like thirst is desire is different than will. So the idea that free will itself has decided it wants to create a superorganism that has constant manifestations of new phenomenology, then says, I will that it has death so that it has this, challenge of trying to do this as quickly as possible because I want to see this, evolve as quickly as possible. So the restraints that are there are created from free will. I mean, I'm just saying it's a plausible other alternative.
if you're talking about Advaita Vedanta, are you talking about that?
Yeah. And the term,
I think that has deterministic implication. There are a lot of verses. I've even made a video on that. There are a
I would
lot of
love to see
verses
it.
in
I will watch it.
yeah in Advaita Vedanta which says that the world is deterministic. Krishna says that. Yeah, there are a lot of verses. I can't recollect all of this right now, but yeah, you can watch the video if you want. But yeah, I would like to ask Janadi, do you think that Laplace's demon is not logically possible?
Do I think that Laplace's demon is not logically
possible? Yeah. I mean, the question is whether Laplace's demon can predict the future or not. Logically, I'm not saying physically.
Well,
if Laplace's demon knows all the particles and the momenta of all the particles, and he knows the conjunction of all the laws of nature, I'm not saying one law like if this then that. I'm saying if all the laws are conjunctioned together into one, he knows all of that, and he knows all the particles and all the momenta of all those particles. Can he predict the future?
I don't think he can, because even if he knows about all of the particles, including in our bodies, he still can't predict whether I'm going to lift up my mouse or not, and I'm not going to lift up my mouse right now.
Okay,
and he
so
he
it seems like you're not a materialist.
I would actually, curiosity, just say I kind of agree that Laplace's demon exists to an extent by looking at DARPA experiments, but that there's also a range, I would agree with Gennady, where it can't be exactly precisely confident about everything that's going to happen, even though it can pretty well within a range of 9 days tell us what we think is most likely to happen. That doesn't mean it can be perfect.
Well, can I just quickly say that it's a very predictable free will person argument to pick up something or wave your hand. I imagine that you're right-handed, and that's why you picked up the mouse with your right hand, right?
I'm left-handed.
So like it's like throwing things around,
I elected
threatening to
to
hit
I picked
people,
up
and
my
all.
right
It's very
hand,
common.
and I'm
Almost
left-handed.
every one of these debates, you see somebody do something like that.
Andreas, you're just using your right hand because cultural forces manipulated you.
Well, you got to keep your left hand hidden. That's the rule.
It's clean hand, dirty hand.
In that funny point that Seth made, he just explained it all, because if not the physics, then the culture is determining what you're doing. So,
but you can always attribute it to something, and thereby you make that argument non-falsifiable. Because yes, retrospectively, you could say we all have a bunch of influences on us, so you pick an influence that plausibly conforms to the action that was actually performed. And yet, that's not necessarily what actually happened with that individual making that choice. Because my lifting up the mouse or not lifting up the mouse, either of those courses of action is entirely compatible with the laws of physics. So there's nothing in the laws of physics that says I am physically incapable of lifting up that mouse right now. I have the equipment to do that. And likewise, I have the ability to refrain from doing that. And if you say, well, I'm doing that to prove a point, or I'm doing that to reflect some sort of cultural conditioning, or I'm not doing that to be contrarian and also to prove a point, you could make all of those statements that to some extent might be explanatory. You might, on some occasions, be correct in saying this went through my mind. However, that doesn't mean that I couldn't have done otherwise. I could have done otherwise, and then you could have looked back
If the
at
laws
that
of
choice.
nature and the previous conditions had been different, you could have done otherwise, right?
So I know this is like not exactly relevant, but to me, does Krishna have free will or not? Because
So
it seems
does
like
God have-
metaphorically and all, but like, you know what I'm saying? Because it kind of relates to this.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, even Krishna doesn't have free will, because the future will pan out the way it was meant to pan out, and Krishna doesn't have a choice about the future. It depends. I mean, there are a lot of contradictory verses in all the scriptures you can find. Yeah, so then we'll have to go to the God and theology, and that's just another can of worms we don't want to open right now. I mean,
I'll do it again another time, but just the idea that everything comes from this concept of free will, and then it's creating ranges of limit so that these things are forced to do the things. Like there is, of course, this idea that we're limited, but that seems like a later synthetic. It doesn't seem like the initial state then. And so then it would suggest that either Krishna or consciousness or whatever we're going to call this primordial thing does have free will, because it's elected to let this happen.
Okay, if Krishna knows the future, if he's omniscient and he knows the future, I think the future is set and he has no choice about it. But it depends on how we define God and what kind of God you're talking about. Maybe we can talk about that later. I just have one question to Janadi. I'm sorry, Seth. I'm sorry to interrupt.
It's fine.
Are you a determinist?
I would not call myself a determinist in the sense that I don't believe that the future is determined based on the past, based on what has happened already. Retrospectively, you can explain events using the laws of physics or whatever influences you choose. And
you admit it has an influence on the future, right?
Well, there are influences do not mean 100% ability to predict.
It means they're not. That's true, but nobody's saying that. Nothing that you're saying is in any way contradictory with what I or what Curiosity is saying. Every single thing that you hold on a second. Every single thing that you have said in your position are not things that we disagree with. Even you have said there's constraints, there's influences. That's what those constraints and influences are what makes it not free. You are a determinist, you're not a fatalist, and you're not talking about free will. You're just saying that we have choices and there is will.
And influence is not the
what
same.
we're talking about.
And influence
That's
is
not what we're talking about.
But hold on. This is really relevant. And influence is not the same as being influenced. Okay, sorry.
See, so I would like to jump in. See, you're talking about influences and constraints. Okay, let me suppose Janadi is saying that there are some choices in which we do have free will. I can agree some of the choices we don't. Maybe he's saying like that. Let's suppose he's saying like that. There are some choices in which we have free will. The other choices, we are influenced, completely influenced and constrained. In this free will choice, we are not. There are influences, but you are the ultimate decider. What I'm saying is that it's just our epistemic understanding. I mean, the lack of understanding, epistemic lack of understanding of all the influences. You might think of a few influences. Oh, like I was brought up this way. I was born in this country. I was born in this culture. These are the influences, but these are not determining me while making this choice. But there are other influences that you're not aware of. The other influences I'm talking about are the things happening in your brain, constraints of laws of physics, and all those things. You're probably not accounting all those influences while you're saying that free will does exist. you're saying that, okay, some influences do exist, but I'm the ultimate decider. But what are you? You are a collection of those atoms, and you are bound by the laws of physics and by the laws of biology, psychology. Psychological determinism is there, and chemistry. All those bound you. We're just not aware, but there are a lot of influences that we're not accounting for. Probably Janadi is not accounting for while we are taking one decision.
I feel like if you were to look at the political body of the human organism, you think of the different aspects of like a tumor emerges when there's a mutiny, right? So there is a lot of levels where it is. These things are an accumulation of choice making cells, or even it sounds like it goes even more low, like, and then up. Well, now we have a political body of these organisms that are making decisions, and you can see how that doesn't work out for everybody either. But they're still made up of people that make decisions. And if governments were to say people don't have personal ideas and choices and emotions, it would be ridiculous. So I feel like that might be the same thing that when we say that these cells, how could these cells really care about what happens to them? Well, it seems like according to medicine they do, because otherwise they get really upset at the body, right? And if you go back even further, structure. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, keep going.
Suppose your primate brain is trying to force you into an emotional decision. I had mentioned this point earlier, and you're thinking, no, I have free will. I have to make the rational decision or something. That's what you might be thinking is free will. I have to make the rational decision, and I'm in control. Like I said earlier, the rationality itself, you are not free to be rational. You were just convinced by that rational argument.
But you have the capacity to be emotional. You have the capacity not to be. You have more capacity.
You can either be emotional, you can either be rational.
You can do both at the same time,
and you can be both at the same time as well. But you don't decide or determine what the exact weight of that mixture of thought is. You don't decide that. It's all happening in the brain.
I think
you don't
Cyrelin has a point.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Seth. I had just been wanting to jump in here for a moment because, David, you had been saying that none of us have been addressing your main point here, right? That freedom is essentially no influences, no constraints. You need to be absolutely like, oh my God, I'm God, free from like, okay, yeah. That's like a very extreme, like almost, I would suggest, to the point of like uselessness sort of view. Like
that's why people reject free will.
Though you can't, it's a useless way to look at it because
I agree.
Well, but that's a straw man position because
no,
nobody who
actually
means. Nobody who actually advocates for free will believes that we can make any possible choice. We can make a wide range of choices subject to certain influences or constraints that do not predetermine the specific choice that we're going to make. So there are some extreme positions. One is the straw man position that we are completely unconstrained. And the other extreme is what Curiosity articulated, that we are slaves to everything, to either our reason or our emotions or our evolved impulses or our subconscious, or to a stack of influences that we can go into as deeply as we want to explain why every action was predetermined. So what I'm saying is there is a kind of golden mean between those extremes that acknowledges that we are subject to certain influences, but those influences don't completely tell any potential observer what we're going to do. We still have a wide range of actions within some set of parameters, and maybe some people have a wider range of actions than others, and they can shape the course of the future of humanity.
And on a cosmic scale, right? Because we might say that there's this common task, but the fact is everything is possible. It's crazy how much is possible and is happening. And so if you're looking at it from this individual perspective, you might lack a bit of free will, but if you're looking at it from the entirety of not just humanity but existence, it seems like it's coming from free will, and it's allowing for everything to happen through you, through me, etc.
Now it would depend. Yeah, Seth.
Just a quick thing is like what's the obsession with the adjective free? Because like when we talk about consciousness, we don't say I have omni-consciousness. We just say I have consciousness.
Yeah,
And
but if I
we
talked
think
about
of-
Vishnu, I would say
It's
he
like-
has omni-consciousness, right? We're talking about
Right,
gods.
but we
I'm
don't-
a big
we
fan of
don't-
looking at it from macro and micro scale. If
But
we're going to evolve into the perfect
That's a
thing
really
possible.
great analogy because we don't believe Vishnu exists.
But
So we don't believe omni-consciousness
believing
exists.
anything, right? We're believing
Right?
science can make anything possible. We're going to become an immortal being that's omnipotent, omnipresent, knows everything, has avatars. Tell me where to stop. Like, we're going to create the things that you're dreaming of. Okay.
Well, the problem is we reject the usage of a magical adjective. Free is as magical as omni.
Right.
It's as magical as universal. It's too powerful of an adjective, and it's not appropriate for the situation.
Right.
So
we have highly
we
conditioned
defining
will.
free?
We have choices. It's just not that it's unconstrained or free. It's informed by something. It's contextualized. It's so maybe we're beating a dead horse here. Let me offer up a potential alternative question. If you're interested, is anyone interested in exploring a different
I guess
realm
we'll have
of
to hear it
question?
before we know if we're interested or not.
Well, I'm curious. I would like to ask Cyrelin about the combination problem. Like, I don't know if you've heard of this problem. It's a problem for people who believe that consciousness is primary and that everything has consciousness. For example, earlier, Gennady brought up the idea of chairness, right? So, like, if you have all of these individual small consciousnesses and they all have souls, and then they come together to create like another level holon, how do higher level souls get invented by lower level souls? That's the combination problem. Like, is my vacuum or is the chair conscious because it comes together and creates something bigger than the sum of its parts? And if some things look like they're conscious and some things look like they're not conscious, how can you tell what's really conscious and what's really not conscious if it doesn't actually distribute any of the characteristics of consciousness? What does it mean to say, this might be another question, what does it mean to say that like the lowest level things are conscious if, like, for example, we can do the double slit test and get the same results every time predictably? We can do chemistry and get the same results every time. Where's the freedom in that if it's so predictable?
Let's say we have an experiment to see if someone's intelligent, right? And so we're like asking them a series of questions in English, right? And they're from Africa and they can't, so you decide to shoot them because they're not intelligent, right? That's the problem with deciding, because you're deciding at that point, it's a serious thing. You're deciding whether something is conscious. And I would say it's better to err on the side of assuming everything is conscious than it is to just presume, well, I can decide when something deserves to be considered conscious to me. I think that's a dangerous game to play.
Valid.
Right?
Well, but
Well,
scientifically,
we understand how capacities come online because we understand the correlating equipment that makes
well, you're
them
just
possible.
saying what's valuable to you. You're like, this thing can do what I think
I'm not
is
saying
valuable.
it's
So it's
valuable.
conscious. It's able to make choices. I put a rat in a maze. It's really good at it. I put a rock in a maze. It wasn't good at it. It's not conscious.
You're making an argument about good and utility. I'm asking a question about how we know what's true. Those are different questions.
Right. It's dangerous to presume it's not. And I don't, unless you had
Okay,
way more
let me-
evidence to presume that it wasn't consciousness, then I'd say it's a dangerous.
let me say how we know, like David said, how we know what's true. Like, we know scientifically that for consciousness, it requires either a brain or a central nervous system or a mixture of both. That's what we know
Subjective
scientifically.
consciousness.
Yeah. So that's how we go about our morality, I guess. I don't know if who is vegan here or not. I don't know, but yeah, I'm one. David is one as well.
I think the idea of being conscious, like you're saying, might build up on, you know, your ideas and your awareness of the reality. So you're making more and more choices based on that. But even on the most inert level, you know, mushroom will turn, you know, to face like the dirt that's a flower faces for
Yeah.
photosynthesis, these things. And
That's response to stimuli,
Yeah,
but
sure.
that's just response to stimuli. That's just
okay,
reflection. It's
whales
the
have
phenomenon.
to choose to breathe, right? Like, or else they die. Every breath is a
Well,
choice for a whale.
there's a whole spectrum of consciousness. No one's denying that plants. I wouldn't deny that plants have a form of consciousness, although we wouldn't call it subjectivity, right? So this is the problem with even
I
using the
wouldn't call
word
it sentient.
consciousness. It's not sentience. It's not sapience. It's like something like pre-sapience or whatever. You can't even really use the word
So,
consciousness
like,
because even
what about
like
a redwood
people who
forest that can feel what's going on in Big Sur and also feel what's going on in Northern California simultaneously? Isn't that cooler than whatever we're talking about? We're comparing it to what we have again, you know?
we're talking about if things like gold or chairs or whatever are conscious. We're not asking if living beings are conscious. We can let's just grant that. Let's be as gracious as we can be and say this word, because I think consciousness as a word becomes basically kind of useless when it's used to describe all these different levels of complexity, right? Like,
I
because
mean,
even people,
I try like electrostatic, right? I might say a chair hasn't consciousness, it has electrostatic, right? But that limits what I believe a chair is. So I kind of feel like it does have awareness of the fact that it exists. It might not know exactly what it exists for, who is sitting on it without eyes, but it's still made up of structure that's aware that it's here and you're there. There's a unanimity -1, right?
Well,
That kind of emerges.
I just want to add my quick little tidbit. For me, consciousness is like a complete red herring. Like to me, there's like no connection between consciousness and free will. Like if I wanted, I could just grant that everything in the universe has consciousness. That does nothing for me in terms of free will. You know what I mean?
Okay,
Well, I
well
think
then, well,
consciousness is a
okay.
prerequisite to free will in the sense that you have to experience the act of deciding, the act of choosing. You have to be aware of it in order to be able to exercise it. Otherwise, well, a program is not conscious of itself, at least not the programs that exist today. And we can't say to any meaningful extent that that program has any sort of will, any sort of ability to choose. Even if it's a generative AI and it's very creative, it's still not volitional and it's not self-aware either. But I do want to say I sympathize with the position of erring on the side of recognizing something as sentient or as conscious, and hence I made a point about certain animals having consciousness to at least some degree and even having volition to at least some degree. And of course, the relevance of this politically is in regard to the Transhumanist Bill of Rights version 3.0, which the Transhumanist Party has promulgated, where we attempt essentially the most inclusive formulation of rights, where we also recognize that rights should be proportional to the amount of sentience, the degree of sentience that a particular entity would have. And for instance, we believe that it should be prohibited to kill, say, higher animals, dogs or cats, who aren't harming somebody, who aren't putting people at risk of contracting diseases. It should not be allowed to just arbitrarily deprive them of life because they have a certain amount of
I agree
consciousness, a
with you.
certain amount of
But in order to
sentience.
make that distinction, you would have to be able to make distinctions about levels of consciousness and these different capacities that are, and for example, Cyrelin, she has this idea that everything has free will and everything has a soul, but she also says that free will is only possible when something like metacognition or awakening happens, and only the highest developed beings are capable of doing that, only of meditating and transcending the self and deconstructing and getting to that place. Like, and it's because we have certain equipment that allows for those things to even be possible. So on her view, I don't understand how it would make sense to say that if metacognition or something like that is, or transcendence of our conditioning is required to have something like free will or to choose from this perspective beyond our conditioning, how you could really then say that anything or most anything even has free will, because it's incredibly rare that anything can do that. And then even in the context in which anything can do that, as we've said, it's more like a state of witnessing. And if a judgment comes up, that's kind of more just like the egoic thinking mind in the context of Buddhism or something like that. That's coming from conditioning. That's like the same voice coming in through the back door. That's not coming from metacognition. So it seems like on her view, it's kind of incoherent whether anything actually has free will or not, even though she wants to say everything has free will. But I'd be interested to hear what she has to say about that.
You know, that's actually a fair point. It might be a little bit. It might be a little bit of misleading to say everything has actively free will. I would suggest that the active exercise of free will is indeed quite rare, like you're suggesting. Like it is actually rare to have that moment of clarity where you can make the choice and change. Like basically any actor, if they get to that point, can change everything for everyone with that choice. Who knows?
Are the
Sterling,
smallest things, like, is a plant capable of that? Like, do they have the equipment to be able to have metacognition and transcend their plantness to be able to have free choice in terms of
That's
what
a good
chemicals it
question.
wants?
Concerning the redwoods, like Andreas brought up, 1,000 years old. Some of them, like some of these trees just are way sort of beyond us in terms of like age, for example. They've been sitting there
Okay.
for who knows how long, isolated to some degree, but they spread out their tendrils. Perhaps they have made sort of a union with the fungal sort of mass that stretches out
So
across
this
that.
comes back to Gennady. Like, what do you have to say about this? You said it was really important to be able to make a distinction about these different levels of cognition, so that way we can extend better rights to things that are more and more complicated because they have more capacities to feel. And I totally agree with that. That's why Curiosity and I are vegan, is because we care about the feelings of these animals, and like their experiences matter to us. But we're less concerned with like cutting into a carrot, let's say, than we are cutting into your cat, right? So we would
Right.
make that distinction. That's important to us.
I would
Right?
go further though. Yeah, I would say like that's the reason it doesn't work that way for me. Like, because I would go full Jane and I would only eat like the toenails of trees. I would eat fruit, but I wouldn't eat like root plants and like murder carrots, right? Like that seems like that's just about the same thing. And the idea that you're saying this has more choice, so it deserves more consideration, that might be true.
More ability to feel based on the
But I don't. Yeah,
equipment that it has that allows for that.
totally different though. Totally different. I don't agree.
It's not about the choice. It's about its capacities
the
based
fact
on the
that
equipment.
like this is like, take it from a dude who lived with redwood trees. Like they feel, like they can, like a tree can feel with its root structure being cut down another tree within the entire range of all the trees because they're connected in the network. They also interact with mycelium. We've talked about that ever before, but the idea that mushrooms and animals are more closely related through Opisthokonta and they're using the same neural hormones as us. Mushrooms are probably at least, if not more,
do those
sentient
trees have the ability to feel pain and pleasure?
Yeah, are you not just projecting your own human understanding of subjectivity onto these things because they're living?
I think not, because this is the other thing. People associate the idea of pleasure, their idea of pleasure, with their different drives of hormonal responses. So really this reductionism of, you know, I'm running from a tiger, so right now I have to throw it into the algorithm of I should be prioritizing escaping the tiger, not digesting, you know, I should probably be using all of my adrenaline. These kinds of things that we have as reduction, for sure, like that exists with trees, with everything. And they're saying this is good, this is a practical thing that'll help me along. Maybe it'll be if I was trying to have more trees exist and be in a larger forest, these choices are good for me. Same thing with mushrooms. Like, it's so clear that mushrooms are moving nutrients around the soil and choosing, like, actually making paths for water and nutrients filled with in the water to fill, so they help other things grow. Beavers, similarly. Why do beavers destroy rebuild deserts into forests, right? What is the value there? Why don't they just stay in one place, right? Like, it could be just determinism, that biology has just evolved to this conclusion.
They have the
But
desires, but they didn't choose.
That's, again,
ha-
to me, it says that Vishnu's got free will, right? And then we are just like the creations that are having the limits, these minor limits, by the way. Like, so you're, again, like, whether we live for 80 years or a million years or something like that, you can do so much in a week, right? Like, so the idea that these limits mean that we don't have free will, I feel like that's almost spoiled, right?
Yes, I agree with you, Andreas. I think maybe our main difference is actually in the meaning of the term free, because I think the determinists are claiming that to be free is to be completely unconstrained. You can do anything you want, anything possibly that you can imagine. You have the ability to choose.
I wish I was a squid.
And my view is that, yes, there are limitations on outcomes that are achievable and various constraints on that, but one can still be practically free. And the analogy I would make is to the political context. So we could speak of certain societies or certain states of the relation of the human being to one's government as being free or unfree, or as being more free or less free. So we are not completely free right now in the United States. I'm sorry for those who thought that we were, but we're not. We have various constraints. Some of them are really unjustifiable constraints that we have had imposed on us, and no good political theory would justify those constraints. However, could we still be said to be freer than people in North Korea? I would say so. Could we be said to be freer than people in the majority of the world right now? I would say so. And moreover, I think the amount of freedom we have should also be understood in the context of what we want to achieve with our lives. So for the majority of the goals that we have, are we politically free to pursue them right now? I would say still that is the case, even though some would say, some political libertarians would say with some justification, that scope of free action has been narrowing, and it has been narrowing to an alarming extent. But still, we can achieve most of our goals. So we are mostly free politically in the United States. So this is an analogy. Going to the realm of will and choice, we are mostly free, I would say, to make the kinds of choices that would have the outcomes in our lives that we would want to have, either in terms of what do we want to achieve for ourselves, or how do we want to treat other people. So we are free to make moral choices. We are free not to kill people. We are free not to transgress against them in significant ways. And I think that's very important as well. That doesn't mean we're free to make every single choice that somebody could conceive of, but we are free enough to make the choices that matter. And that, I think, is the free will position that I feel like
we could probably make those happen eventually. Even if I can't do it, if I come up with something, I bet you in a million years it could happen somehow.
Sure. Through technological progress, through uncovering that chain of causation that would lead us to eventually be able to make that choice if we live long enough, and hence I'm a proponent of indefinite life extension as well.
Gennady, I have a question for you. It seemed like on one hand you wanted to err on the side of caution and extend the idea of everything being conscious. On the other hand, it seemed like you wanted to make an important distinction about levels of cognitive complexity. Where did you actually come down on that conclusion? I don't think I understood.
Right. Well, there has to be gradations of consciousness. So it's not that every single thing is conscious. What I mean is, if we have some evidence of sentience or self-awareness, if we see a creature that's behaving like us in certain respects, then it would be better to err on the side of attributing some faculty to that creature. Like if a cat is displaying behaviors that seem an awful lot like emotions, and it's communicating with us in ways that display certain kinds of what seem to be sentiments, we attribute those types of features to the cat.
Sure.
Instead of saying, oh, it's just a sophisticated automaton, it doesn't really feel
But
those.
you would make a distinction between cutting into a cat and cutting into a carrot.
Absolutely. Absolutely, I would.
Yeah.
And I don't think the carrot is conscious.
I would make a distinction too. I just am saying, like, it's still a thing, right? Like,
Yes, it's still a thing, but it doesn't have feelings like a cat does.
okay, like, make it different for you. Like, imagine that you come across a desert, and in the middle of the desert, there's one little dandelion, right? Just a single dandelion, all right? And you murder that dandelion. Do you feel bad yet? You know? Like, if there's ways to look at it. You could be like, oh, well, there's so many carrots. Like, there's so many carrots.
I think life matters. I think all life matters, and if you can do less harm, you should. If you're doing harm to living things,
does that dandelion have the potential to become a whole field of dandelions? Can those dandelions evolve into flowers that?
I mean, if you go out of your way to step on that dandelion, you're kind of a jerk, right? Like, I'm not denying that it matters. I'm just saying that there's a spectrum of consciousness, and we should probably care about the some things more than others. And also, I think that there's that probably also Gennady would also probably draw a line, and he would say things that are less complicated than this are not living.
Right.
So,
right.
I kind of want to jump in on this a little bit.
I just want to say I would use curiosity's word weights. I would put weights of importance. I think it's a good way to put it.
But before I jump in on consciousness, I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. I know we're going pretty late. Is everyone okay? Should we start to conclude pretty soon?
I think we should.
I'm okay soon. Yeah.
Let's finish the hour and then we'll get done.
Yeah.
I think we should conclude shortly. So we've been going for almost 3 hours now.
Yeah, let's finish this hour. Let's get like another 10 minutes in, and then we'll say where everyone get their content. What do you say about that?
Yeah.
Any more last questions?
If anyone has to leave early, it's fine. But yeah, we can finish at 3 hours. So for this consciousness thing, like, I feel like it's not as confusing as a lot of people make it out to be, because we have our own bodies as kind of a test case, as a test subject, and we kind of know how sentience works in our bodies. Like, and it just, I guess neuroscience is complicated, but if you understand a little bit of neuroscience, it's like, well, when you have pain receptors, that is what allows you, it affords you the ability to feel pain. And if you remove your pain receptors, you lose the ability to feel pain. And there can be, like, your body can still have defense mechanisms. It can have immunities. It can react to dangers. Like, a plant is reacting to all these dangers. But if you lack, like David, he had a great word, is the equipment. If you're lacking the sentient equipment, you lose the sentience. And we can see that in our body. There are some things that we are sentient of, and there are some things we are not. And there's a pretty clear line on that distinction. It's not as vague as people might want to make it out to be. But the problem is, back to my earlier point, is like, none of this gives you free will, because a pain receptor, well, there's no free choice in having the feeling of pain. It's based on the electricity flowing into the pain receptor, and electricity is deterministic. It's a cause and effect. One neuron activates the next, bing, 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 boom, you got pain, right? And so there's no system of freedom in any of that consciousness.
Pain is not a choice, but sometimes how you respond to pain can be a choice. If you have the even more sophisticated equipment to interpret your pain, understand where it may be coming from, understand the degree of severity and maybe the degree of threat that it poses to your health. So, for example, if you're exercising and you are experiencing pain, but it's a kind of pain that you've come to anticipate as an outcome of exercise. Perhaps you're thinking, oh, I'm just working my muscles a bit hard and this pain will subside and I'm okay with it. I'm okay with pushing through the pain. I am an ultra runner, so I know how that can be. Versus if you have a pain that is of similar intensity, of similar kind, but you don't know where it's coming from. You don't know whether it's temporary or whether it will last, whether it's life-threatening or not. You're going to have a very different reaction to that pain. And of course, a simpler being that can experience pain might not be able to make those distinctions because that being doesn't have the conceptual equipment or the physical equipment to really interpret the pain. So to a great extent, I agree with what you've said, David and Seth, in that you need certain physical equipment to be able to have certain sensations or then to be able to have thoughts about those sensations. And I also think past a certain level of complexity and certain types of physical equipment, you can start to modulate how you respond to those sensations as well.
Sure. What's the difference between a
But
runner and an ultra
you're
runner?
not free to choose that.
An ultra runner is anybody who can run distances beyond a marathon.
That's
So,
badass.
okay, it seems like we're all a little bit like it seems like a little bit hung up on this idea of how everything is almost sort of hypnotized by their desires and like what's the will behind it saying, like the sneaking in the back door, like, oh, what's the ego trying to tell you what to do, and all of these
People's
things.
demons.
Right, exactly. The demons and then the higher self versus the ego, and they're all like trying to like fight over control of this body, right? Like, it's all a little bit
This is an
strange.
ultra runner, by the way. This is
Hey. So you know, if you get to the point where you were talking about it, David, uh, where it's almost like you have to get outside of outside of all of these factors, and be able to observe it from the outside perspective of where all these desires, the voice of the will, the voice of all these things, where are they coming from? The question becomes, can you get to that outside perspective? And you know, again, I'll bring it back to all of the spiritual practices because it's interesting for me. I went way hard into atheism way back when I was in high school and kept with it for a long time because I was like, this is all bullshit, you know. Excuse me, but you go into all of the science of it, and exactly. There's nothing there. I went real hard determinism. I convinced my best friend of determinism way back in the day. So I've come way around on it to the other side because I started to notice. You talk about we haven't gone back into the origins of things, but I have. Like, that's the thing. I started to notice. Oh man, all of these religions are saying the origin of everything is kind of the same as the science is saying the origin of everything is. What the Big Bang is comes from nothing. The one single thing explodes into everything. Yeah. They're all saying the same thing from different perspectives, including science. There's not really any kind of a actual contradiction. They're just looking at everything from different perspectives. So I would suggest, like, how do you get to that Buddha perspective? How do you get to that outside perspective?
Yeah, but can the smallest units of things, like, can they get to that Buddhist perspective? That's what I was asking. Like, can a carrot become like have
That's not the smallest thing. That's not the smallest thing.
I know, no, I
Let's
know,
go,
right? So
let's go to
so
ribonucleic acid. Can
okay,
ribonucleic
yeah.
acid do that?
Can a cell do it? Like,
No,
because the
ribonucleic
claim.
acid. Let's go.
Okay, but the
because
claim
that's what it
was
is, right? That's what ribonucleic acid is. It is that.
the claim was that that the universe is built from free will all the way down and back. But then at the same time, the other claim was that, like, you kind of have to get to this Buddha perspective to really have the free will.
What do you think's
and
more?
so then the question is, are these lower level things capable of that with,
it's chicken or the
their
egg.
out their equipment?
What created what? Did free will choose to create limits, or did limits come up with free will? Which makes more sense? It's way more likely that free will decided to create its own limits than it is that limits somehow expanded to the probability that we're talking about a phenomenological diversity that we're talking about, right? It makes more sense if we started out with free will and had those limits.
Well, raise your hand if you're an emergentist.
I mean, something emerges.
I mean, thinking that, like, complexity emerged. It wasn't like there, because I mean, you're kind of putting the fruits at the roots, right? If you're saying that, like, there was a consciousness, this
I'm fruits at the roots. Fruits at the roots.
This individual subjectivity that chose to do all this, like, you're kind of like saying that there was this developed thing that then created development.
That's me. I picked that one.
So, like, where did that come from, right? Like,
where did that come from?
Where did the thing that burst into everything come from? Like, where?
Right. Well, on the scientific view, it's just like the universe recycles on itself. There's not in science. It's not from nothing. In science, they don't, first of all, they try not to make really claims about what happened before the Big Bang. There's just theories about it. But it's like the Big Bang, Big Crunch is like an option, or maybe the Big Bang is on the other side of black holes, and the universe is like, they have other ideas, but no one really says that it came from nothing. It's like it maybe
like
came
it was
from
forever.
Yeah, like the energy just recycles and moves around. No one's saying that, like, scientists don't believe that there was a being of beings beyond everything that came from nowhere.
There probably was, though, right? Like, let's be real.
For there to be
Why
like
postulate this?
I'm just gonna be real.
If something had to be infinite, why can't the universe be infinite? Why do you feel the need to postulate an extra entity?
Well, I
to
think
explain
the universe
it.
I mean, this is a completely different conversation that we should
It's
save
all
for another
the
time.
entity.
But I think I think that Narayana is the source, and then from the source, which is like the vessel, from there's like this Mahadevi kind of like Icha Shakti we're talking about that emerges, and from there, from will, there's also will has the thirst and desire, and those things make it possible for it to, beyond that self, have limits, which make it, because of the thirst, desire what it drinks from. And I think that's like a primordial thing that makes everything possible. So that is my I also think it's also proven by looking at geometry, like we talked about. If you look at this natural nanostructures of reality, if you look at double helixes of DNA, if you look at how things are held together, that diamonds exist, that carbon can be diamonds, it just seems so ridiculous to me that we're pretending that we're getting to like levels of sophistication that we're going to come up with diamonds, when diamonds are where we come from. We learn from diamonds, right? That's, to me, like obvious. Like, that's the primordial thing. Like, it starts out perfect and we just try to copy it until we get better at it.
We got to get curiosity.
Starts with desire. In Hinduism, I've heard that it all starts with desire, like Vishnu's desire, like I said. Are you a Hindu?
I mean, I practice Sanatana, but I wouldn't say I'm a Hindu per se, but kinda, I guess. I'm also a Mormon.
What's your dharma?
Yeah, right. Like, I was raised Jesuit Catholic, but I'm part of
There's
X
a mixture of all that.
Yeah, X Church.
Now you're
I
gonna be a transhumanist like
I just
Janadi.
sort of realized
Definitely.
today that probably the main thing that I've actually legitimately been almost practicing worship from what I've come to understand is Matangi, the goddess Matangi, that comes, as I understand, is the ninth that comes before Kali. But it's a little, yeah, it's the goddess of the spoken word and music, and it's a very kind of an interesting mythology. Yes, yes, where the gods are eating and they drop leftover food, and it's like cursed and nobody wants it. It's like infected with like I don't know, godliness or like godly saliva or some shit. And she springs up from this and asks them, "Can I have some?" And that is like a sacred thing here. It's like she's the residue left, the spiritual residue left after everything else dies. And you know, like it's very it's a trip. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to don't let me take
I had
over.
a question for you regarding meditation. So when you meditate, don't you feel that the thoughts are just arising in your brain, in your consciousness? I'm sorry, they're just popping out of nowhere into your consciousness. You're just witnessing them. You're getting aware of the thoughts, but you didn't author them. Are you not able to subjectively feel that when you meditate?
Like that is the thing. Mm, y- if you can get to the point, if you can get to the point where you can sort of just hover at the subconscious state where it's almost, almost that dream state, almost, but not quite, and you're still able to observe reality, you can sort of start to see how the symbols are coming in unfiltered. Like, exactly what the symbols are, and you start talking about symbols like you want to talk about epistemology, like, and how we understand things are true, how we're getting to the bottom of everything. Very much what I've been doing my whole life is getting to the bottom of language. It's the symbols behind everything, and they say in the beginning it was a word. The Tao is not the named thing is not the Tao, but the nameless thing is the Tao, right? It's nameless, you can't be named, but the named thing is the mother of 10,000 things. Once you start with saying, this exists, boom, everything exists.
I
I don't
didn't get the answer to my question.
Are you saying when your mind fills with ideas? Like, so if you do 108 Gayatris, then you're able to focus on your breathing and move away from your own thoughts, right? And a lot of the time, the most famous monks are people that are isolated, like Abraham in the Bible lives in a cave as a child, so he doesn't see idols, right? And that makes it possible for him to see more purely without this influence. But influence is also something that can be dismissed or denied, right? You can respond to influence by saying no. And the idea that you have to
exactly.
say no because that's who you are, that's not necessarily right either. Like, you're able to be influenced or choose not to let influences control you. A big thing here, I think, is this idea that we're all reactionary. I don't think we're all necessarily reactionary. I've met people that are really good at choosing their actions, that are really good at stopping themselves from reacting and then choosing their actions after either feeling or thinking about it, right? That's a big difference, is the amount of time. Like, this is a big thing with Thomas Jefferson talking about duels, right? Before I have a duel with someone, I count to 10. If I still want to have a duel with them, I count to 100. If I still want to have a duel with them, then I set it up for in 10 days, or, then we wait a month. Like, you have so much time to think about your actions. Choose to do that, because then you have the capacity to make better and better choices. And so you might think you have no free will because you're limiting yourself from having so much more free will than you could have.
Okay, so we're getting to the point where we need to wrap up. So I'm thinking maybe we can just have everyone go in a circle and just kind of give a statement about like how this conversation has like pushed you in any direction, and and then we'll close on that.
I just want to respond to Andres by saying that to not the desire to not be influenced by influences is itself another influence. It's just another
If you
desire.
choose to always
Yeah.
not, if you're choosing to always, yeah. But if you're like every time I hear something, I think about it. Like this conversation, like we're thinking about everything.
Yeah.
I'm not judging each one of you that I'm going to not agree with you before I talk to you.
Gennady has to leave, so we have to let
Yes.
him get a word in.
So I think it's clear that we experience the act of choosing, and we experience the possibility of different alternatives. I think the differences among us in this debate or discussion are in terms of how meaningful that subjective experience is, and whether that subjective experience is a reflection of a more fundamental real phenomenon, or whether it's just an illusion and our actions are actually determined by some set of influences that completely rule out our agency over them. And I actually think in practice, we believe that we can influence outcomes. And I think that is a fundamental part of our being. I think the determinists might say that's something nonetheless that is instrumentally useful, even though it's not fundamentally what goes on. And in practice, I do think we can come to very similar conclusions, like the idea that there are gradations of sentience, for example, and those may have implications on how we treat living beings. I think in practice, we can come to outcomes within society or norms or institutions that look fairly similar, even if some of us come from a perspective of free or sufficiently free will, and others come from a more deterministic perspective. And it is still worthwhile to reason through some of those practical outcomes and see where we have common ground. So that's where I'll leave the conversation.
Cyrelin, you want to go next?
I I guess. I guess. I don't know. I don't know. It's definitely been a lot to think about. You brought up a lot of good points that help me, I think, understand exactly how I will need to, I think, structure my argument to make this coherent, to make this understandable, because I think I can. But you showed me exactly the ways that we can do it. So maybe for next time, if there might be a next time, I would think that it would be pretty cool if we could get together and do something like this again, because it seems like there's a lot left unsaid. I think there's
For
a lot
sure.
left that we can talk
For
about.
sure.
There's a lot of points that I have not brought up that I'm, they're like trying to get out, but yeah. If anybody else has an outro.
Curiosity.
Okay, so firstly, I would start by responding to a few points that I haven't. I wouldn't have a good sleep if I don't respond. So I would like to say that the commitment towards truth, or the commitments towards being rational, we do not choose that desire either. This is, I'm kind of responding to Janadi. Mm, that's not free. That desire is not the desire of our commitment towards truth and rationality is not free. We didn't choose to be a rational person. We just like we didn't choose to like to eat food. Did we choose to like to eat food? No, we just find ourselves as beings that like to eat food, and we have other desires. We like a certain person. We don't choose, oh, let me choose this person as the one I love for fun. We don't do that way. That's not how will works. We're not free. There are there are always conditions and factors that are influencing our behavior. Just like that, the commitment towards truth and rationality is also not free. That desire to be rational is not free. We just find ourselves evolutionarily, we have derived that desire because it helps us live and go ahead into the future. Sometimes being truthful just helps us live and procreate and flourish as a species. So that's not an evidence for free will. And no matter how much you focus or not focus, like I've already mentioned, that all the desires, counter desires, intentions and counter intentions, and whatever there is, there are different circuits, neural circuits that are at work, that are at play, that determine what kind of a decision we make, if it's rational or if it's emotional. So some people bring up free won't, like we might not have free will, but we have free won't, which is to resist an influence. The phrase resist an influence was brought up again in the conversation earlier. So the the impulse to resist an influence is also determined by another circuit, perhaps, and we don't choose that either. I would like to also mention that this is a very crucial part. This point just helped me, understand the lack of free will very easily. It's just simple. It's pretty simple. Like whatever we do is influenced by processes happening in our brain, but we don't control the processes happening in our brain. Like we able to consciously control what's happening in the neural circuits, like how much charge or uh, synaptic weight and that a particular desire has? Are we able to control the charge? Oh, let me put a little bit more sodium and potassium ions here and a few more conduction of electrons from this neural circuit so that this is the outcome. We
You
don't do that.
realize you're talking to transhumanists, right? Sorry, I had.
So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. And there's a lot I want to talk about the self that we can maybe talk about later with Cyrelin and even Janari. And yeah, what else? Okay, so Janari was saying that it's just sufficient to have this feeling of free will or the experience of free will for us to have free will. That's just what it means to have free will. Like we have experience of a lot of things that are untrue. We experience the earth to be flat. We experience uh, like the earth is the center of the universe, or things like that. There are a lot of intuitions that we have that is wrong, uh, like witchcraft and all. We had a lot of such experiences and delusions and hallucinations throughout the history of humanity,
Out of
and
body
we have
experiences.
exactly. So throughout history, we have been finding out scientifically that we were wrong all the way through. And experience is not an excuse to posit a particular phenomena like free will. Like we might have an experience of free will. I agreed with that, but that doesn't itself say that free will actually exists in the universe. So, for example, we dream, right? We all dream. The experience is such that it's actually happening. It's reality. It's actually happening. It feels like that. But is it actually happening in reality? No. So the experience of free will is not a good excuse to posit the existence of free will. And yeah, so basically that's my point. I can make a lot more arguments against free will, but I would just like to bring up determinism once again as a closing statement, that either the world is deterministic or it is indeterministic. Let's suppose that we are okay. I think Janadi says that we are not living in a deterministic world, and he even rejects Laplace's demon. He thinks it's not logically possible either. But many most of the compatibilist or even libertarian philosophers would agree that at least Laplace's demon is logically possible. Uh, but yeah, if determinism is true, we don't have free will, causal determinism, right from the start of the universe, causation, cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. We have the initial conditions, and we have the laws of nature. None of them we author, and these two interact, and every future state is determined. So what I'm going to say next is determined. I have not decided what I'm going to think next, and yet, and that's exactly why I don't have free will. So yeah, that's probably where I would like to end. I have a lot more arguments that I would like to discuss, but maybe in the future. Yeah, it was fun talking to you
Okay.
guys. We had a lot of points. I mean, it was fun talking to you all. I didn't think it would be such a pleasant conversation.
Oh,
So
yeah,
yeah, I
absolutely.
hope I see you soon. See you all soon. Yeah, thank you.
Yes,
You
indeed.
too. It's good to meet you.
David.
Yo, I am the universe authoring itself through particularity, through fractal eternities. I'm in the point of all places, man. Fuck it, I'll put my brain in a robot body.
I agree 100% with that.
I had lost me in the second
There you
half.
go,
Oh,
David.
no.
Now
kidding.
you got me.
I had a good time
automaton.
with you guys. I had a good time with you guys. It was fun talks. I don't really feel like a case for free will was really made here.
Yeah, in the world,
you know, as we can clearly see, the determinist came out on top from the beginning. Stayed there the whole time. What can we say? But I enjoyed. I did enjoy talking.
Thousands of years. So give it time.
I enjoyed having talks with all you guys. Thank you so much for inviting me. Seth, what did you get me into here, man? Yeah, thanks to everybody for holding up their end of the conversation and for putting up with me talking so much. You can all check out my YouTube channel right here if you want to hear me talk a bunch more. And yeah, peace.
Yeah, that was a great point. Yeah, I think a lot of the people here have YouTube channels, so we'll definitely have to get those in the description.
Andreas, do make that without fail. Dude,
I will make sure. I promise you. I give you my word. And Janai
I'll follow up on him.
Yeah, everyone will make sure. But also, we'll definitely talk again. We'll do this again, and we'll also have individual. I'd love to talk to each one of you about different things. So that would be wonderful. Yeah. Another thing I'd say is I was going to assume that Gennady would win in my heart, or that maybe somehow determinism, because I was kind of leading towards, well, free will is kind of illusionary to an extent. But I think it's answered by Cyrelin, because the idea that it's free will that is the origin point, and that it's not the individual that has maximal free will, that's answered by the idea that free will is something beyond the self, but the superorganism of humanity is able to achieve all these things. So to me, it seems like that kind of answers it. It's that, yes, free will exists. It's not necessarily emergent, but there is something that is emergent, which is the capacity of phenomenology. So I agree with Gennady to an extent. I thought I'd agree with him 100%. But Cyrelin, good points.
Thank you. I thought you would be able to hear me. I know I can be a little bit muddled with how I speak, you know.
I get where you're coming
ADHD, you know what I mean.
And Seth, yeah. I'm sure Seth has like some black pill for us. I know you wanted to like close with like a Darcidius moment, so go for it.
I'm just gonna like drop a transcendent mic drop.
All right, let me put on a Horton. Here's a who, and you go for it.
No one gets to respond to this. This is a final word, right? No. Basically,
I'm glad I'm on Seth's side.
Yeah, right.
I feel like the determinism of the brain, it's basically algorithmic. And so like when we have a software program, you can program these different like NPC agents within a video game, and these software agents, they can have choices. But nowhere in those system of choices is a non-deterministic freedom. Like all of the causation of ones and zeros, antecedent programming, all the way flows down into the choices of the software program. Just because it has options does not mean it has free will. And I think that was probably the most important takeaway, because it seems like the gap was between free will and choices. Drawing a hard line between those two seems like an important distinction.
All right. Okay, I'll take it. You guys know that crabs keep evolving, right? Like, so this is something for the determinist side. I'll end it with this. The crabs keep evolving. Everywhere you go, more and more things evolve into crabs. Maybe you guys are right. I don't know what else to say. Even humanity itself has like a civilization on its back, sort of like a hermit crab shell. So I don't know. Maybe there is some determinism to it. Yeah, there could be. I'm giving you that one. All right.
Evolution is deterministic.
That could be something to it. I'm just saying. Should I let you guys say where to get your information like really quickly, or are you guys tired and want to just like send them the links?
Okay, so you can find me youtube.curiosityguy, whatever, and Andreas will anyway put it in the description. You can find it out. Please check out my content. I have a lot of arguments I've made against free will, and there are more yet to come. Many interesting arguments. I've discussed a lot on physics of free will, and I've discussed a lot on God and free will as well, but I don't discuss whether God has free will. I'm discussing only if humans have free will, if God is real. And I'm going to be talking about neuroscience and psychology as well in the future, so stay tuned and stay curious.
Awesome. Well, I know, Gennady, you got to get going.
Yes.
I just want to make sure everyone sees the USTP website, and thank you for all being here. And everyone else, I am David Long. I'll share your link as well. Thank you guys for being here, and I'll see you guys soon. God bless.
The world is very different now. For man holds in his mortal hand the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life.
Begins a very special time of the year for us. It's the time of peace and reflection. One thing we should all be thankful for is that we live in America, where we have the freedom to change things and the opportunity to grow.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. And will, to the best of your ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.